Welcome to the channel Stories to Relax. I'm Bento, and here we take things gently, letting the mind slow down as we dive into fascinating stories told at just the right pace to help you relax, or maybe even drift off to sleep. If you prefer a softer narration, try setting the playback speed to 0.8. The North Sea does not forgive. In the 9th century, these grey and turbulent waters were the edge of the known world for many, but for one man, they were just a road. Ragnar Lothbrok stood at the prow of his longship, salt spraying against a face that would one day haunt the nightmares of kings from Paris to Northumbria. The wood of the ship groaned under the pressure of the waves, a sound like dying beasts, but Ragnar did not flinch. He looked at the horizon with the hunger of a wolf who knows the winter is coming. To the Saxons, he would become a devil. To his people, a hero larger than life itself. But before the legends, before the songs sung in great halls about dragon slayer and king, there was just a man shivering in the cold, calculating the distance to a glory no one else could see. History struggles to separate the flesh from the myth, the farmer from the king, the reality from the saga. But on that freezing deck, amidst the roar of the ocean, the distinction did not matter. Only the destination mattered, and the destiny he carved with blood and iron. To understand why the name Ragnar Lothbrok still echoes 1200 years later, you need to step away from the longship for a moment and look at the library, or rather, the lack of one. The Vikings were exceptional at many things, building ships that could cross oceans, navigating by the stars and finding creative ways to acquire other people's gold, but they were terrible at keeping meeting minutes. They did not write down their history, they sang it. And when you sing history after a few horns of strong mead, facts tend to get a little flexible. Modern historians look at Ragnar and get migraines. Some say he never existed at all. Others argue he is a combination of several different warlords. A King Horik here, a Regan Heiress who attacked Paris there, and a dash of Norse mythology to spice things up. Basically, medieval storytellers might have taken the greatest hits of the 9th century and attributed them all to one superstar. It is the historical equivalent of crediting every pop song of the 1980s to a single artist. But here is the thing. To the Saxon monks watching dragon heads emerge from the mist, it did not matter if the man holding the axe was a composite character or a real king. The fear was absolute, the fire was very real. The 9th century was a time when the map of Europe was being redrawn in blood. Charlemagne's great empire was fracturing into pieces. England was a patchwork of squabbling petty kingdoms, and the North was waking up. Ragnar represents the precise moment the Scandinavians realized the world was bigger, richer, and significantly less defended than they had assumed. He is the avatar of the Viking Age itself, ambitious, brutal, and undeniably charismatic. Whether he was a farmer who simply wanted better land or a king descended from Odin is almost irrelevant to the narrative now. The shadow he cast was long enough to cover a continent. We are about to step into a world of wood and iron, where honor was the only currency that mattered, and death was just a gateway to a very loud party in Valhalla. To see the man, we must first see the world that forged him. The saga begins not with a crown, but with the cold wind. To understand the man who would challenge kings and defy empires, one must first understand the rock he crawled out from under. Scandinavia in the 9th century was not a place where you lived because the weather was pleasant. It was a place you lived because you were tough enough to survive it. It was a world defined by the brutal binary of the seasons, the long sun-drenched days of summer when the earth finally softened enough to be tilled, and the endless, crushing darkness of winter when the sun seemed to abandon the north entirely. In this environment, survival was not a guarantee. It was a daily negotiation with the elements. The geography itself was a challenge. Norway was a spine of jagged mountains dropping into deep, freezing fjords. Sweden was a dense forest, broken by lakes that looked like black glass. Denmark was a flat, sandy bridge between the North Sea and the Baltic. There were no nations yet. If you asked a man from Kattegat if he was Norwegian, he would look at you with genuine confusion before probably taking your purse. People identified by their tribe, their valley, or the Jarl they swore allegiance to. It was a fragmented world of petty kingdoms, where a king might be nothing more than a local bully, with a bigger boat and a better sword than his neighbors. Power was local, personal, and extremely volatile. A king kept his crown only as long as he could provide silver and glory for his followers. If the silver dried up, or if the glory faded, the king usually found his career ended abruptly by an axe in the back. It was a cruel human resources strategy, but it ensured that only the most competent or the most paranoid leaders survived. In this vacuum of central authority, a specific culture of honor flourished. But honor, in the 9th century, did not mean being polite or telling the truth. It meant reputation. A man was the sum of what people said about him. You could lie, cheat, and steal, provided you did it to your enemies and brought the loot back to your family. But if someone insulted you, if someone questioned your courage, you had to answer in blood. To let an insult slide was to admit weakness, and in the North, weakness was a death sentence. This created a society of hair-trigger tempers, where a drunken argument over a game of Hanafatafel could escalate into a blood feud that lasted 3 generations. It was exhausting, but it kept everyone on their toes. Religion was the glue that held this chaotic mess together, but it was not a religion of comfort. The Christians to the south had a God who loved them, a shepherd who watched over his flock. The Norse had Odin. Odin did not love you. Odin was the All-Father, but he was also a paranoid war god who had plucked out his own eye for wisdom and hung himself from a tree just to see what would happen. He was the god of poets, frenzy, and kings, and he was primarily interested in gathering strong warriors for the final battle, Ragnarok. This meant that the Norse view of the afterlife was essentially a recruitment drive for an apocalypse militia. If you died of old age or sickness, what they called straw death, you went to hell, a grey, boring place where nothing happened. If you died in battle, weapon in hand, you went to Valhalla to feast and fight forever. This theological framework created a very specific psychological profile. When death is not the end but a promotion, you take risks that would seem insane to anyone else. It removed the fear of mortality. In fact, it made a violent death desirable. It is very hard to intimidate an enemy who actually wants you to kill him so he can go drink mead with his ancestors. The Christians, with their fear of hellfire and judgment, were completely unprepared for men who laughed while they bled. However, geography and religion alone do not make a Viking. You need technology. And the Scandinavians had developed the single most advanced piece of military technology of the early Middle Ages, the longship. To the uninitiated, it looked like a large canoe. To a sailor, it was a miracle of engineering. It was clinker-built, meaning the planks overlapped, held together with iron rivets. This made the hull flexible. When a wave hit a rigid Roman galley, the ship fought the water and often broke. When a wave hit a Viking longship, the ship bent with the water. It danced. More importantly, it had an impossibly shallow draft. A longship carrying 50 armed men could float in 3 feet of water. This changed the fundamental rules of warfare. Before the longship, if you wanted to invade a country, you needed a deep water port. You had to announce your arrival. With these ships, the Northmen could cross the open ocean, sail up a river, and beach their ship on a riverbank 80 miles inland. They could strike a farm, a monastery, or a village in the middle of nowhere, burn it, loot it, and be back on the water before the local lord had even put on his boots. It was the medieval equivalent of a teleportation device. It turned every river in Europe into a highway for invasion. The ship was not just a vehicle, it was the center of their existence. It was where they slept, ate, and fought. The bond between the crew was thicker than family. They sat on their sea chests, rowing in perfect unison, pulling against the grey Atlantic, trusting their lives to the wood beneath them and the man steering at the stern. It required a discipline that contrasted sharply with their wild reputation. You cannot row a ship across the North Sea if everyone is doing their own thing. On land, they might be individualistic berserkers. On the water, they were a machine. By the early 9th century, the pressure in Scandinavia was reaching a breaking point. The climate was warming slightly. The so-called medieval warm period was beginning, which meant better harvests. Better harvest meant more babies survived infancy. More babies meant a population boom, but the land did not grow. Scandinavia is mostly rock and ice. Good farmland is a finite resource. Suddenly you had a generation of second and third sons. The eldest son inherited the farm. The second son might get a few cows. The third son, he got a pat on the back and good luck. Scandinavia was full of young, testosterone-filled men with weapons, ambition, and absolutely no property. They had two choices: stay home and work as a servant for their older brother, which was humiliating, or build a boat and go find their fortune elsewhere. It was a socio-economic time bomb waiting to explode. And the fuse was the stories that travelers brought back. Stories of lands to the west and south, lands where the sun shone, the soil was rich, and the people were soft. Lands where the temples were filled with gold, but guarded by men who did not fight, only prayed. To a young Norseman, this sounded like a joke. "You mean they leave the gold in a building with no guards?" they would ask. "And they just sing at it?" It seemed too good to be true. This was the world into which Ragnar Lothbrok stepped. A world of iron, wood, and salt. A world where the sea was the limit of imagination for some, and the beginning of opportunity for others. The traditional path for a man of ambition was to fight his neighbor, steal his cows, and maybe become a local chieftain. But the North Sea was getting crowded. The petty wars were yielding diminishing returns. The smart ones, the visionaries, were starting to look at the horizon and wonder what lay beyond the mist. The culture also demanded greatness. It was not enough to be rich. You had to be famous. The Skalds, the poets, were the most important people in society because they controlled the narrative. If a Skald sang about you, you were immortal. If he ignored you, you were dust. This thirst for legacy drove men to do impossible things. They did not just want to win, they wanted to win with style. They wanted a death song. They wanted a saga. This vanity combined with their fatalism made them incredibly dangerous. And then there was the concept of Weird, fate. The Norse believed that the Norns, 3 giantesses, sat at the base of the world tree, spinning the threads of destiny for every human being. Your length of life was decided the moment you were born. You could not change the day of your death. You could hide in a hole, and if it was your day, you would slip and break your neck. You could charge an army of thousands, and if it was not your day, the arrows would miss. This belief liberated them from anxiety. If the date is set, why worry? Why hesitate? The only thing you could control was how you faced it. Would you meet your fate standing up, laughing, or cowering on the ground? This fatalism combined with the economic pressure created the perfect storm. The young men of the North were ready. They just needed someone to show them the way. Someone who looked at the open ocean and saw a road instead of a wall. Someone who was willing to sail west into the open unknown against the prevailing wisdom that said there was nothing there but monsters and the edge of the world. The trading centers like Hedeby and Birka were buzzing with rumors. Traders from the south brought glass, spices, and silk, but they also brought intelligence. They spoke of the Franks, a mighty empire but overstretched. They spoke of the British Isles, divided into kingdoms that hated each other more than they hated outsiders. The geopolitical situation in Europe was a mess, and the Vikings were the perfect opportunists to exploit it. They were not mindless barbarians. They were astute observers. They watched. They waited. They tested the defenses. Life in the villages, the future Katteguts of the world, was a cycle of labor and preparation. In the winter, the men repaired nets, sharpened swords, and carved dragon heads for the prows of their ships. The women, who held significant power and ran the farms while the men were away, spun wool for the sails. The sail was the most expensive part of the ship. It took years of labor to make one square sail. It was a community investment. When a ship sailed, the entire village was invested in its success. If it sank, everyone lost. If it returned with silver, everyone feasted. The atmosphere in these longhouses during the deep winter was thick with smoke and expectation. The elders told stories of the gods, of Thor fighting giants, of Loki's tricks, but the younger generation was starting to get restless with the old stories. They wanted to make new ones. They looked at the grey sea and felt the pull. The call of the West was not just a poetic idea. It was a gravitational force. It was the promise of land for the landless, gold for the poor, and immortality for the brave. Violence was the language of the age, but it had its own grammar. There were rules. You did not kill a man in the night. That was murder. You killed him in the day, face to face. That was combat. You did not burn a house with women inside unless you gave them a chance to leave. Of course, these rules were flexible when it came to foreigners, but among themselves, there was a code. A man who broke his oath was a nithing, a nothing, a wretch. To be an oath breaker was worse than being dead. In a society without written contracts, your word was the only thing that allowed commerce and alliances to function. Ragnar would become known as a man of many contradictions, but in this world, his ability to inspire loyalty, to make men swear oaths and keep them, was his true superpower. As the 9th century matured, the technology, the culture, and the necessity all converged. The ships were ready. The warriors were hungry. The gods were watching. The board was set for a game that would change the history of the world. The pieces were moving. The kings of the south sat in their stone castles, secure in their belief that the world was ordered and civilized. They did not know that in the frozen inlets of the north, a wave was building. It was a time when a man could rise from nothing if he had the will, a time when the hierarchy was fluid. A farmer could become a jarl could become a king, and a king could become a legend. But the first step was always the hardest. You had to leave the safety of the shore. You had to trust the wood and the wind. You had to believe that there was something on the other side worth dying for. The North Sea was not a barrier. It was a challenge. It tested you. If you were weak, it swallowed you. If you were foolish, it froze you. But if you were strong and if you were lucky, it carried you to glory. The stage was set for the age of Vikings. The curtain was rising, and waiting in the wings, sharpening an axe that would soon become famous, was a man whose origins were already beginning to blur into myth, a man who looked at the impossible and saw only an opportunity. The era of the North Seas had begun, and it was waiting for its main character. Trying to find the birth certificate of a 9th century Viking is an exercise in futility. The Norsemen did not keep archives. They kept grudges. They did not write memoirs. They carved rune stones, usually to brag about something they killed. Consequently, the origin of Ragnar Lothbrok is less of a historical fact and more of a choose-your-own-adventure novel. Depending on which dusty scroll or drunken saga you consult, he was either the son of a powerful king, a rebellious farmer with an attitude problem, or a demigod sent by Odin to make life difficult for the rest of Europe. The truth, as is often the case with men who become myths, is likely buried somewhere in the mud between these versions. But each version tells us something vital, not just about the man, but about what the Vikings needed him to be. Let us start with the official story, or at least the one that sounds the most like a medieval soap opera. According to the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, who wrote centuries later and was desperately trying to make Viking history sound like refined Latin literature, Ragnar was royalty from day one. In this version, he was the son of the legendary king Sigurd Ring. This puts Ragnar in the velvet cradle of power, or rather the fur-lined cradle, since velvet was in short supply in Scandinavia. Being the son of a king in this era was a dangerous job. Succession was rarely peaceful. It usually involved a lot of swords, a few poisoned cups, and a sudden decrease in the number of living relatives. When Sigurd Ring died, the kingdom did not just politely hand the keys to Ragnar. That would have been too easy. Instead, chaos erupted. Enemies from neighboring tribes, cousins with weak claims but strong armies, and ambitious jarls all saw an opportunity. Ragnar, still young, was forced into exile. This is a classic narrative trope. The boy king cast out into the wilderness, forced to learn survival the hard way. It fits the hero's journey perfectly. In this version, his greatness was in his blood, dormant, waiting for the right moment to reclaim his birthright. He gathers his loyalists, learns the art of war not in a palace but in the forests and on the decks of ships, and returns to sweep his enemies aside. It is clean, it is noble, and it creates a direct line of legitimacy for the Danish kings, who claimed descent from him later. It is also quite possibly political propaganda invented 300 years after the fact. Then there is the other story, the one that smells less like a library and more like a campfire. In the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, his origins are defined not by who his father was, but by a very specific and slightly ridiculous fashion choice. This is where the name Lothbrok comes in. It translates roughly to shaggy breeches or hairy breeches. Imagine being the most feared warlord in Christendom, the scourge of Paris, the man whose name made bishops wet their beds, and your historical nickname is essentially Fuzzy Pants. The story goes that a powerful jarl, sometimes a king named Herod, had a beautiful daughter named Thora Townheart. Thora, like many people with too much time and money, decided to get an exotic pet. She chose a lindworm, which is essentially a small dragon or a giant snake. It seemed cute when it was small, coiled inside a box of gold. But, as reptiles tend to do, it grew and grew. Soon it was encircling her entire bower, eating an ox for every meal, and generally bringing down the property value of the entire kingdom. The Jarl, realizing he had made a terrible mistake in pet ownership, issued a challenge. Whoever could kill the serpent would win Thora's hand in marriage. Enter Ragnar. He was not a king in this story yet, just a warrior with an idea. He knew that snake venom was a problem. His solution was primitive, but brilliant. He took a pair of coarse wool trousers and a shaggy cloak, and he boiled them in pitch and tar. Then he rolled in sand. The result was a suit of armor that was flexible, tough, and presumably smelled absolutely terrible. When he faced the serpent, the beast struck at him, but its fangs could not penetrate the thick, tar-hardened wool. Ragnar killed the snake, won the girl, and earned the nickname that would stick to him forever. It is a fantastic story. Is it true? Probably not. Giant snakes were remarkably rare in medieval Sweden, but the story serves a purpose. It tells us that Ragnar was ingenious. He did not just use brute force, he used his brain. He adapted. He saw a problem, venom, and engineered a solution, tar pants. This trait, the cunning trickster, is the core of his character. Whether he is tricking a snake or tricking the King of France, Ragnar wins because he thinks sideways. He is an Odinic hero, favoring wit as much as strength. The shaggy breeches story grounds him in folklore, making him a folk hero who rises by his own merit and creativity, not just because his dad was famous. There is a third angle, one that modern storytellers love to explore: the idea of Ragnar as the farmer, the common man. This is the version where he starts with nothing but a plot of rocky soil and a deep burning dissatisfaction. In a society stratified by birth, the idea of upward mobility was limited. You were born a Jarl, a Carl Freeman, or a thrall slave. Crossing those lines was difficult, but the Viking Age was unique because it was a period of disruption. If a farmer built a boat and came back with enough silver to buy the entire valley, who was going to tell him he was still just a farmer? This Ragnar represents the entrepreneurial spirit of the age. He looks at the thin harvest, looks at the tax collector, and decides he has had enough. He challenges the local authority, the Earl, not because of a prophecy, but because he disagrees with the business model. "Why are we raiding the glowing, impoverished East?" he asks, "when the stories say the West is rich?" This Ragnar is relatable. He is driven by curiosity and the desire to provide for his family. He is not fighting dragons, he is fighting the status quo. When he defies the Earl and sails west, he is breaking the law to prove a point. This version of the legend resonates because it is about meritocracy. It suggests that in the chaotic world of the Northmen, a man was worth exactly what he could take. And then, looming over all these versions, is the shadow of the gods. Ragnar claimed, or his sons claimed for him, descent from Odin himself. This was a standard political move in Scandinavia. If you want people to follow you into certain death, it helps if they think your great-grandfather hangs out in Valhalla. But with Ragnar, the connection felt deeper. He had the Odinic traits, the wandering spirit, the quest for knowledge, the unpredictability, and the use of deception. He often appeared with ravens. He sought to know what the fates had in store. This divine connection added a layer of inevitability to his actions. If Ragnar was favored by the gods, then opposing him was not just bad strategy, it was heresy. It also meant that his failures could be explained away. If things went wrong, it was just the gods testing him, or perhaps Loki interfering. It gave him a Teflon coating against criticism. When he stared at the ocean, he wasn't just looking at water, he was looking at a domain he felt entitled to by divine right. Historically, the water gets even murkier. We have Frankish chronicles that mention a chieftain named Regin Heirus, who attacked Paris in the year 845. Is this Ragnar? The name is similar. The date fits. The audacity fits. But this Regin Heirus died shortly after the raid, struck down by a plague that the Christians happily called divine judgment. If this was the real historical Ragnar, his career was spectacular but short. However, the legends say Ragnar lived for decades, raiding England, Ireland, and returning to France. This suggests that Ragnar Lothbrok might be a composite character. Perhaps there was a Regin Heirus who raided Paris. Perhaps there was another chieftain who raided Northumbria. Perhaps there was a third who fathered the famous sons. Over time, the Skalds, sitting in smoky long halls during the endless winters, stitched these men together. They needed a superhero. They needed a central figure to tie the great events of the age together, so they created Ragnar. He became the magnet that attracted all the loose iron filings of history. Every great deed, every clever trick, every daring raid was attributed to him because it made the story better. Does it matter if he was one man or three? To the victims, no. To the Vikings, also no. The symbol was more powerful than the man. Ragnar became the archetype of the Viking king. He set the standard. Every king who came after him had to measure up to the ghost of Lothbrok. He was the gold standard of glory. Imagine the young men of Kattegat or Uppsala listening to these stories. They hear about the man who wore tar pants to kill a dragon. They hear about the farmer who became a king. They hear about the son of Odin who sailed into the unknown. It ignited a fire in them. It validated their own ambitions. Ragnar was the proof that the horizon was not a limit. Furthermore, his origin story sets up the tragedy of his end. Whether born a king or a farmer, his rise was so meteoric that his fall became inevitable. The Greeks would call it hubris. The Vikings called it fate. A man who climbs so high eventually attracts the attention of forces, human and divine, that want to bring him down. But in the beginning, he was just potential. He was a young man looking at a spear, checking the edge, wondering how far he could throw it. The confusion about his birth also served as a protective mist. If your enemies don't know who you really are, if they don't know if you are a peasant or a prince, they underestimate you, or they overestimate you. Either way, they are confused, and a confused enemy is an easy target. Ragnar thrived in this ambiguity. He let the rumors fly. Is he a god? Is he a demon? Is he a farmer? Ragnar didn't answer. He just sharpened his axe and smiled. He knew that the story would be written by the winner, and he intended to win. Even his wives, and we will get to the formidable Lagertha soon, add to this mystique. A man's origin is often defined by who chooses to stand beside him. That a shield maiden of Lagertha's caliber chose Ragnar speaks volumes about his character. She did not choose a title, she chose a man. She saw something in him that the chroniclers missed, a fire that would burn down half of Europe. So, was he born of legends? Yes, because in the end, history is just the agreed-upon lie, but legends are the emotional truth. The emotional truth of the 9th century was that the North needed a monster to scare the South, and a hero to lead the North. Ragnar Lothbrok filled the job vacancy perfectly. He stepped out of the mist of the Baltic, shook the frost from his cloak, and walked into immortality. Whether he was wearing royal silks or tar-covered trousers while he did it, is a detail for the academics to argue about. For the rest of us, and for the warriors who manned his oars, he was simply Ragnar, and that was enough. In the vast and often bloody tapestry of Viking legends, there are many women who are mentioned as footnotes, mothers of kings, daughters of alliances, or prizes of war. And then, standing entirely apart, holding a shield in one hand and likely a severed head in the other, is Lagertha. To define her simply as Ragnar Lothbrok's wife is to misunderstand the fundamental nature of their relationship. She was not his shadow, she was his mirror. She was the steel against which he sharpened his own legend. In a society that was undeniably patriarchal, where men held the political power and the property rights, Lagertha carved out a space for herself that commanded not just respect, but fear. The story of their meeting is one of the most cinematic moments in the sagas, recorded with a mix of awe and slight confusion by the chronicler Saxo Grammaticus. It did not happen at a dance or a feast. It happened appropriately enough on a battlefield in Norway. A local tyrant named King Fro had invaded the region, killed the rightful leader, Ragnar's grandfather, and, in a particularly cruel display of dominance, placed the women of the royal family in a brothel to humiliate them. When Ragnar arrived to avenge his grandfather, he expected to find victims waiting to be saved. Instead, he found an army. The women, refusing to be victims, had dressed themselves in men's clothing and taken up arms, and leading them was Lagertha. She was described as a woman with the courage of a man, fighting in the front lines with her hair loose over her shoulders, so that everyone would know exactly who was killing them. Ragnar, who was busy trying to organize his own shield wall, found himself distracted. He watched this woman cut through the enemy ranks with a ferocity that matched his own. She was not fighting like a conscript. She was fighting like a Valkyrie who had gotten lost on the way to Valhalla and decided to start the party early on Earth. Saxo writes that Ragnar attributed the victory of that day largely to her. Think about that for a moment. A Viking warlord, a man whose entire reputation was built on his own martial prowess, admitted that the battle was won because of a woman he had never met. It was an admission of equality that was rare for the 9th century. It was also the moment he fell completely and arguably foolishly in love. Ragnar looked at the carnage, looked at the woman wiping blood from her sword, and essentially decided that he needed that kind of terrifying energy in his life permanently. However, courting a shield maiden was not a simple matter of bringing flowers or reciting poetry. In the Viking world, courtship was often a contact sport. Ragnar sent messengers to her, inquiring if she would be interested in marriage. Lagertha, who was clearly enjoying the game, did not say yes, but she did not say no. She played coy. She feigned interest, but set up defenses around her home that sent a very clear message. If you want me, you have to survive me. According to the legend, which almost certainly drifts into the realm of metaphor here, Lagertha placed a bear and a giant dog, essentially a wolf, at the entrance of her dwelling to guard her from suitors. This was the 9th century equivalent of ghosting someone, but with significantly higher stakes. Most men would have seen a bear in the doorway and decided that perhaps a nice, quiet girl from the neighboring farm was a better option. Ragnar, however, saw it as a challenge. It was a test of worthiness. A woman who guarded her door with apex predators was not looking for a husband to take care of her. She was looking for a partner who could keep up with her. Ragnar arrived at her home alone. When the beasts attacked, he did not panic. He speared the bear and, in a display of brute strength that likely strained a few muscles, strangled the hound with his bare hands. Then, presumably covered in fur and blood, he walked into the house and asked if she had any other pets that needed disciplining. It is a ridiculous, violent, and utterly charming story that perfectly encapsulates the dynamic of their relationship. It was a union formed in violence and respect. Lagertha accepted him not because he was a prince, but because he was the only man who could walk through her defenses without flinching. Their marriage was a partnership of two alphas. In the domestic sphere of the Viking Age, the wife held the keys to the household. This was literal. She wore the keys at her belt, and symbolic. She managed the farm, the finances, and the food. But with Lagertha, the dynamic was different. She was a warrior in her own right. When Ragnar was away, she did not just manage the farm, she ruled the lands. She dispensed justice. She maintained the peace with the edge of a sword. She was a skjaldmø, a shield maiden, a figure that has debated historical authenticity but undeniable cultural power. Whether there were armies of women is debated by archaeologists, but individual women warrior graves prove that Lagertha's archetype was based on reality. They had a son, Bjorn. Though the sagas are confused about which mother belongs to which son, the narrative tradition binds Bjorn Ironside to Lagertha and two daughters. For a while, they were the power couple of the north. They raided together, fought together, and likely argued with the intensity of a thunderstorm. Imagine the dinner table conversations. "How was your day, dear?" "Fine. I killed 3 Saxons and burned a watchtower." "Pass the salt." It was a relationship built on shared passion and shared adrenaline. But history, and Ragnar's own flaw, intervened. The flaw was ambition. Ragnar was never satisfied. He always wanted more. More land, more sons, more fame. And in the logic of Viking kingship, more sons required more alliances, and often more wives. The tragedy of Lagertha and Ragnar is that they were too alike. 2 fires cannot burn in the same hearth without consuming all the oxygen. The legends say that Ragnar eventually turned his eyes elsewhere. In some versions, it was to Thora Townheart, the snake story. In others, and most famously in modern retellings, it was to Aslaug, the mysterious daughter of the dragon slayer Sigurd. Why did he look away? Perhaps it was political. Lagertha was a warrior, but she was not the daughter of a king or a dragon slayer. Perhaps he wanted a wife he could control, although if that was the plan, Aslaug was a terrible choice. Or perhaps, and this is the most human explanation, he grew threatened by her. Lagertha was not dependent on him. She did not need him to be great. For a man with an ego the size of Scandinavia, that independence might have started to chafe. The separation was painful. Ragnar left. He went to marry another. In many stories, this would be the end of the female character. She would fade into obscurity, the discarded first wife, bitter and forgotten. But this is Lagertha. She did not fade. She did not weep in a corner. She kept her dignity, she kept her lands, and she kept her sword sharp. She let him go because a woman who fights bears does not beg a man to stay. If he was foolish enough to leave, that was his loss. Years later, the saga gives us a moment of incredible poignancy that proves the depth of their bond. Ragnar found himself in a desperate civil war back in Denmark. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and facing defeat. He needed help. He sent out calls for allies. And who answered? Lagertha. She didn't have to come. She had every reason to let him fail. He had abandoned her. He had replaced her. But she gathered a fleet of 120 ships, an immense force, and sailed to his aid. Why? It wasn't for the marriage, which was over. It wasn't for political gain. It was for the bond of the shield wall. It was for the respect that still existed between two warriors who had once fought back to back. During the battle, the situation was dire. Ragnar's son, Sigurd, in this version, was wounded. The lines were breaking. The enemy was closing in. And then the chronicle describes Lagertha's moment. Seeing the hesitation in the troops, she personally led a countercharge. She flanked the enemy, striking with such fury that the momentum of the entire battle shifted. She saved Ragnar. Again, just like the first time they met. The narrative circle was complete. After the battle, she returned to Norway. She did not ask to be taken back. She did not ask for a reward. She simply packed up her army and went home. There is a melancholy beauty in that final departure. It was the closing of a door. They were arguably the love of each other's lives, but they could not live together. They were destined to orbit each other, colliding in moments of violence and passion, but ultimately traveling on different trajectories. Lagertha's story continues, even after Ragnar. Upon returning home to her new husband, a man she had married in the interim, she realized that she had outgrown the role of a subservient wife completely. When this husband tried to assert control over her, leading to a quarrel, Lagertha solved the marital dispute in typical Viking fashion. She killed him. The saga says she hid a spearhead in her gown and ended the argument permanently. She then took over his name, his title, and his sovereignty. As Saxo writes with a mix of horror and admiration, she usurped the whole of his name and sovereignty, for this most presumptuous dame thought it pleasanter to rule without a husband than to share the throne with him. This is the essence of Lagertha. She began as a defender of women, became the wife of a legend, and ended as a ruler in her own right. She represents the fierce independence of the Norse spirit. In the story of Ragnar Lothbrok, she serves as the grounding element. Ragnar was often lost in his own myths, chasing prophecies and destiny. Lagertha was grounded in the reality of blood and earth. She was the one who reminded him and the audience that glory is expensive and it is usually paid for by the people waiting at home. Her legacy is significant because she breaks the mold. In medieval literature, women are often categorized as the virgin, the mother, or the whore. Lagertha was none of these. She was the warrior. She was the kingmaker. She challenges the modern reader to reconsider the role of women in the ancient world. While the Victorian historians tried to erase the Shield Maidens or dismiss them as pure fantasy, the sagas kept her alive. They couldn't delete her, because the story of Ragnar doesn't work without her. She is the only one who ever truly understood him, because she was the only one who was his equal. The relationship between Ragnar and Lagertha remains one of the most compelling aspects of the saga, because it feels incredibly modern. It was a marriage of two ambitious careers. It struggled with the balance of power. It dealt with the pain of growing apart. And it showed that love and hate are not opposites, but very close neighbors on the emotional spectrum. As Ragnar turned his eyes toward the west, toward England and the great raids that would define his later years, he carried the lessons of Lagertha with him. He learned from her that underestimating an opponent based on appearance was fatal. He learned that loyalty must be earned every single day, and perhaps in the quiet moments on the deck of his ship, staring at the grey horizon of the North Sea, he wondered if the bear and the dog were actually the easy part. Crossing the ocean was simple physics. Surviving the love of a shield maiden was a metaphysical trial that left marks no armor could hide. She remained in the north, a queen of her own making, while he sailed into the history books of the West. But in the songs of the Skalds, their names are often sung in the same breath. Ragnar and Lagertha, the sword and the shield, the storm and the anchor. A love story written in blood, ending not with a kiss but with a nod of respect across a battlefield, before turning away to face their separate destinies. The decision to sail west was not merely a navigational choice, it was a theological heresy. In the late 8th century, the prevailing wisdom in Scandinavia held that the open ocean to the west was a chaotic void, a domain of monsters where the world simply ended. To sail east into the Baltic was business. To sail south along the coast was routine, but to point the prow of a ship toward the setting sun and simply keep going, that was madness. It was the maritime equivalent of jumping off a cliff and hoping gravity had taken the day off. Yet, this was exactly what Ragnar Lothbrok proposed. He stood on the grey shoreline of the Kattegat, looking at a horizon that everyone else feared, and he saw a bank vault waiting to be cracked. Ragnar's preparation for this voyage was met with a mixture of mockery and genuine concern for his mental health. The local chieftain, Earl Haraldson in the popular retellings, was content with the status quo. The Earl's business model was low risk, low reward, raid the Baltic tribes, steal their meager possessions and return home with a few bushels of grain and perhaps a goat. It was steady work, but it was not glorious. Ragnar argued that the risk was the currency of glory. He had heard the whispers from wanderers and seen the artifacts drifting on the currents. He possessed a sunstone and a sun compass, tools that allowed him to navigate even when the sky was overcast, giving him a technological edge that his peers lacked. But more than tools, he had an intuition that the world was asymmetrical, that while the north was hard and poor, the west was soft and rich. Recruiting a crew for a suicide mission is a difficult sales pitch. "Join me and we will probably die of thirst or fall off the edge of the world" is not a slogan that fills recruitment centers. However, Ragnar did not need an army. He needed a single boatload of believers. He gathered men who were desperate, bored, or simply trusted him enough to ignore their survival instincts. Floki, the eccentric boat builder, provided the vessel, a new design, lighter and faster, capable of cutting through the open ocean waves rather than riding over them. Rollo, Ragnar's brother in many versions of the tale, joined with a mix of sibling rivalry and bloodlust. They pushed the boat into the freezing surf under a sky that looked like bruised iron. As the coast of their homeland disappeared behind them, the mood on the ship shifted from bravado to a heavy, silent dread. The crossing itself was a psychological torture test. For days there was nothing but the grey Atlantic. No birds, no land. Just the rhythmic creak of the wood, the slap of the water, and the smell of unwashed men and wet wool. In the open ocean, time loses its meaning. The sun rises and sets, but the scenery never changes. Panic is a contagious disease on a small boat. There were moments when the crew looked at Ragnar with murder in their eyes, wondering if they should toss him overboard and turn back while they still had water. Ragnar sat at the helm, maintaining a facade of absolute certainty. Inside, he must have been terrified. If he was wrong, he was dead. If he was right, he was a legend. But leadership is often just the ability to hide your panic better than the people looking at you. He checked the sunstone, adjusted the rudder, and told them to keep rowing. Then the birds appeared. A seagull is an annoying bird on land, essentially a rat with wings. But in the middle of the ocean, it is an angel. It means land is near. The mood on the ship snapped from despair to electric anticipation. A dark smudge appeared on the horizon. It grew into cliffs, then green fields, then a coastline. They had done the impossible. They had sailed off the edge of the map and found not an abyss, but a beach. They had arrived in Northumbria, on the northeast coast of what is now England. Specifically, they drifted toward the holy island of Lindisfarne. To the Vikings, the sight was confusing. They expected fortifications. They expected guards, watchtowers, beacons. Instead, they saw a peaceful, isolated island with a large stone building that looked important. There were no walls. There were no soldiers. There were just men in robes walking around in gardens. To a Viking, whose entire culture was built on the concept that valuable things are guarded by men with axes, this made absolutely no sense. It was like walking into a lion's den and finding out the lions were vegetarians. The date was the 8th of June, in the year 793. It is one of the few precise dates we have in this story, etched into the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle because of the trauma it caused. The monks of Lindisfarne were going about their daily routine of prayer, scholarship, and brewing mead. They were aware of the sea, but the sea was their wall, their protection. They believed that their isolation brought them closer to God. They did not realize it also made them a perfect target for men who did not care about their God. When Ragnar's ship ground onto the pebbles of the beach, the sound was the opening bell of a new era. The Vikings jumped into the shallow water, axes and shields in hand. Adrenaline surging after weeks of confinement, they charged up the beach screaming, expecting resistance. They expected a shield wall. They expected a fight. What they got was a massacre. The monks did not fight back. They ran or they fell to their knees and prayed. For the Vikings, this was baffling. Why were these men not defending themselves? Why were they asking a sky god for help instead of picking up a weapon? The cultural disconnect was total. To the Norsemen, a man who refused to fight was broken, defective. Killing them wasn't warfare. It was almost industrial work. It was harvesting. Ragnar moved through the chaos with a cold, analytical eye. While his men were busy with the sport of slaughter, he was looking at the economics. He kicked open the doors of the monastery and stopped. Gold. It was everywhere. Golden crosses, golden chalices, book covers encrusted with jewels, silver plates. The sheer density of wealth in this one undefended building was staggering. In Scandinavia, you had to kill a king to see this much gold. Here, it was just sitting on a table. The monks had amassed treasure to glorify God. Ragnar saw it as a severance package for the trip across the ocean. There is a dark humor in the encounter, if you look at it from a safe distance of 12 centuries. The monks tried to explain, in Latin or Old English, that these were sacred objects, the property of the church. The Vikings, who spoke only Old Norse and the universal language of violence, likely thought the monks were haggling. "This is the body of Christ," a monk might have stammered, holding a golden pyx. "This is heavy," the Viking would have replied, taking it. They stripped the altars, they stripped the reliquaries, they stripped the monks. However, Ragnar realized something else during the raid. The gold was good, but the information was better. He spared a few of the younger, stronger monks, not out of mercy. Mercy was a luxury item he couldn't afford yet, but out of utility. Slaves were valuable, but literate slaves who knew the geography of this new land, they were priceless. He needed guides, he needed translators, he needed to know if there were more of these monasteries waiting to be harvested. The raid was over in a few hours. The monastery of St. Cuthbert, the holiest place in Northumbria, was a smoking ruin. The blood of the monks stained the stone floors. The Vikings loaded their ship until the waterline was dangerously high. They threw the gold, the silver, and the captives into the hold. Then they pushed off. They did not stay to occupy. They did not stay to fight the local militia. They were raiders, not conquerors. Not yet. As they sailed back into the open sea, the mood on the ship was fundamentally different from the journey out. The fear was gone, replaced by a euphoric, drunken sense of invincibility. They had challenged the ocean, and they had won. They had challenged the gods of the West, and those gods had done nothing. They were rich beyond their wildest dreams. Ragnar sat at the stern, watching the coast of England fade. He held a piece of worked gold in his hand, turning it over in the sunlight. He wasn't smiling like the others. He was thinking. He realized that this wasn't just a raid. It was a discovery. He had found the back door to Europe. He had found a civilization that had grown fat and soft on peace. A civilization that had forgotten that the world is a predatory place. He knew that this gold would change everything. When he returned to Kattegat, he wouldn't just be a farmer or a captain. He would be the man who opened the door. The return journey felt shorter, carried by the winds of success. When the familiar cliffs of their homeland came into view, the crew began to shout and beat their shields. They arrived not as men, but as avatars of a new reality. They unloaded the treasure on the beach, and the crowd that gathered fell silent. They had never seen wealth like this. Gold that shone with a different luster than the pale amber of the Baltic. And the slaves, men with soft hands and shaven heads speaking a strange tongue. Earl Haraldson looked at the treasure with a mix of greed and fear. He knew instantly that his authority was in danger. A king rules by distributing wealth. If Ragnar could provide more wealth in one trip than the Earl could in 10 years, then Ragnar was the new king, crown or not. The seeds of civil war were sown the moment that first golden cross touched the sand of Kattegat. But for Ragnar, the politics were a problem for tomorrow. For now he had proven his point. The West was real, the ocean could be crossed, and the gods were on his side. He had unlocked a secret level of the world, and he had the only key. The fame of the raid spread like wildfire across the north. From the fjords of Norway to the plains of Sweden, the story was told. Ragnar Lothbrok had found the land of gold. Meanwhile, in England, the shock was absolute. The scholar Alcuin of York wrote a letter that captured the terror of the moment. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples. The Christians saw it as the wrath of God, a punishment for their sins. They did not understand that it was simply the economics of expansion. The wrath of the North had officially begun. Ragnar had shown his people that the dragon ships were not just for coastal waters. They were keys to a treasury that stretched across the sea. He had ignited a hunger that would not be sated for 300 years. As the fires of the victory feast burned high into the night, Ragnar Lothbrok watched the sparks float up toward the stars. He knew this was just the beginning. The first expedition was a test. The next one would be an invasion. The farmer was dead. The Sea King was born. The gold from Lindisfarne did not just bring wealth to Kattegat, it brought gravity. Before the raid, Kattegat was a respectable but unremarkable trading station, a collection of wooden houses huddled together against the wind, smelling perpetually of fish and pine tar. After the raid, it became the center of the universe. The treasure that Ragnar and his crew unloaded onto the dark sand was more than currency. It was proof of concept. The sight of strange, intricate golden crosses and cups encrusted with jewels that caught the weak Nordic sun acted like a beacon. Men came from the inland valleys, from the mountains, and from the fjords, drawn by the story of the farmer who had found a way to rob the gods of the West. However, in the 9th century, success was the most dangerous crime a man could commit. In a society built on reputation and hierarchy, rising too fast was interpreted as a direct threat to those already at the top. Earl Haraldsson, the man who technically ruled the region, watched the celebration from his great hall with the sour expression of a man who realizes his stock portfolio has just crashed. He had forbidden the raid. He had mocked the navigation. He had bet against Ragnar Lothbrok, and he had lost. Now every silver coin that changed hands in the market was a whispered insult to his authority. The confrontation was inevitable. Physics dictates that two objects cannot occupy the same space, and politics dictates that two alphas cannot rule the same tribe. Haraldsson tried to handle it bureaucratically first. He summoned Ragnar to the Great Hall, a long, smoky building where the shadows were deep enough to hide assassins, and the air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and tension. The Earl claimed that by law all treasure found by his subjects belonged to him, minus a finder's fee. It was a bold attempt to tax destiny. He sat on his carved wooden throne, wrapped in furs, trying to look like the embodiment of ancient law. Ragnar stood before him, not with the humility of a subject, but with the relaxed posture of a predator who knows he is the most dangerous thing in the room. He did not argue the law. He simply pointed out that without his ships, his sunstone and his crew, the gold would still be sitting on an altar in England. He offered the Earl a share, a generous bribe disguised as a tribute, but he refused to hand over everything. It was a public rejection. The silence in the hall was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the shifting of uneasy men gripping their sword hilts. The Earl took the gold, but his eyes promised violence. He knew that if he did not kill Ragnar, Ragnar would eventually replace him. The escalation was swift and brutal. Haraldsson sent men to burn Ragnar's farm. It was a clumsy move, the act of a desperate ruler. Ragnar and his family escaped, but the message was clear. There was no room for coexistence. The Cold War had turned hot. In the Viking world, there were no lawyers to file restraining orders. There was only the Holmgang, the duel. The duel was set on a small island, or a designated space marked by hazel branches, creating a sacred arena where the laws of society were suspended and the laws of iron took over. The entire population of Kattegat turned out to watch. It was not just a fight, it was an election. On one side stood the Earl, an old warrior who had survived decades of intrigue, armored in heavy chainmail and cynicism. On the other stood Ragnar, younger, faster, and fueled by the absolute conviction that the gods were finding the Earl boring. The fight was short, ugly, and decisive. There was no cinematic music, just the grunting of men exerting maximum effort and the sickening crunch of metal on wood and bone. Haraldsson fought with the desperation of a man protecting his legacy. Ragnar fought with the hunger of a man building one. When Ragnar's axe finally found its mark, ending the Earl's reign and his life simultaneously, the silence that fell over the crowd was profound. They were witnessing a transfer of power that would change the trajectory of the North. Ragnar did not just take the Earl's arm ring, he took his destiny. Ragnar Lothbrok was now Earl Ragnar. The farmer had become the king, or at least the local equivalent. He moved into the great hall. He sat on the carved throne. He inherited the earl's power, his wealth, and his headache. This is the part of the fairy tale that usually gets skipped: the administration. Ragnar quickly discovered that conquering a kingdom is thrilling, but ruling one is largely a matter of dispute resolution. The man who had sailed into the unknown and raided monasteries now found his days filled with listening to farmers argue over who owned a specific goat. He had to adjudicate boundary disputes, decide on fines for theft, and manage the grain stores for the winter. He sat on the high seat, listening to a man complain that his neighbor's fence was 2 feet over the property line, and he must have felt a profound, crushing boredom. Is this what power was? Sitting in the dark, listening to petty grievances while the sea called outside. Despite his personal boredom, Kattegat flourished under his rule. Ragnar was an innovator, and he applied that mindset to governance. He opened the port to free trade, encouraging merchants from the Baltic and beyond to dock without fear of exorbitant taxes, provided they paid their dues to him, of course. Kattegat transformed from a village into a hub. The market expanded, a chaotic labyrinth of stalls selling amber from the Baltic, furs from the Ruslands, walrus ivory from the far north, and now silver and gold from the west. The population swelled. Strangers walked the streets, speaking a dozen dialects. The air buzzed with the energy of a boomtown. Ragnar invested in infrastructure. He ordered the construction of better docks to accommodate more ships. He strengthened the defensive palisades, knowing that wealth attracts thieves. He commissioned a fleet of the new, faster longships, turning the local boat builders into an industrial powerhouse. Floki, the eccentric genius, was given resources he could only have dreamed of, experimenting with hull shapes and sail designs. Kattegat was becoming a military-industrial complex dedicated to one thing: expansion. But the tension between power and freedom gnawed at Ragnar. He observed the other earls and kings of the region, men like King Horik of Denmark. They were powerful, yes, but they were also prisoners of their own paranoia. They spent their lives looking over their shoulders, seeing daggers in every shadow. They were isolated by their rank. Ragnar began to feel that isolation. His old friends, Floki, Rollo, Thorstein, still drank with him, but the dynamic had shifted. He was the Earl now. His word was law. When he made a joke, everyone laughed, even if it wasn't funny. That is a dangerous thing for a man's soul. It makes him lose touch with reality. Rollo, in particular, was a problem. The brother who lived in the shadow. As Ragnar's star rose, Rollo's shadow grew longer and colder. Ragnar tried to include him, giving him command and honors, but jealousy is a cancer that praise cannot cure. Ragnar saw the look in his brother's eyes, the same look the old Earl had. It was the look of a man measuring the distance to the throne. It was a reminder that in this world, trust was a depreciating asset. To distract himself from the monotony of governance and the creeping paranoia, Ragnar focused on the next big project. The first raid on Lindisfarne had been a smash and grab. The next raids needed to be campaigns. He began to plan not just for loot, but for exploration. He spent hours with travelers, interrogating them about the geography of England, the politics of the Saxon kingdoms, the tides and the seasons. He was building a mental map of the world. He learned of a kingdom called Wessex, ruled by a king named Ecbert, a man rumored to be as cunning as Ragnar himself. He learned of the fractured nature of the English heptarchy, 7 kingdoms that spent more time fighting each other than guarding their coasts. It was the perfect environment for a predator. Lagertha, now the wife of an earl, chafed under the domestic duties of the station even more than Ragnar did. She was a warrior, not a hostess. The tension in their marriage, already present, began to fracture under the weight of the crown. She ruled by his side, dispensing justice with the fairness that made her beloved by the people, perhaps more so than Ragnar. This popularity was a double-edged sword. A popular queen is an asset. A queen more popular than the king is a threat. They slept in the same bed, but their dreams were pulling them in opposite directions. He dreamed of empire. She dreamed of a life where she didn't have to watch her back in her own home. One evening, Ragnar walked out of the Great Hall, leaving behind a heated debate about the taxation of dried fish. He climbed the wooden watchtower overlooking the harbor. The cold wind of the Kattegat hit his face, scrubbing away the smell of the hearth smoke. He looked out at the ships bobbing in the dark water. The silhouette of the dragon heads rose and fell with the tide. He realized then that he could not stay in the chair. The chair was a trap. The earls before him had died in that chair, fat and scared. He was not an administrator. He was an explorer. The conquest of Kattegat was complete, but it felt hollow. The ambition that had driven him to kill the earl was still hungry. It wanted more, it wanted the world. He made a decision on that tower. He would leave the day-to-day ruling to stewards and trusted men. He would not be a king who sat. He would be a king who sailed. He would turn Kattegat into the launch pad for the greatest invasion force the world had ever seen. He would take the restless young men of the north, the ones who were starting to cause trouble in the streets, and he would point them west. He would export the violence. The kingdom of Kattegat was just a base of operations. The true kingdom was the sea. The next morning, the orders were given. The blacksmiths began to hammer out swords and axe heads by the hundreds. The tanners worked overtime on leather shields. The women wove wool for sails until their fingers bled. The entire economy of Kattegat was pivoted toward war. Ragnar announced that they would not just be raiding a monastery this time. They were going to find the kings of England. They were going to knock on the doors of their castles and introduce them to the realities of the north. Ragnar sat in the great hall watching the preparations. For the first time in months he smiled, a genuine, dangerous smile. The boredom was gone. The board was set for a much larger game. He had his kingdom, he had his power, and now he was going to use it to set the world on fire. The ambition of one farmer had become the destiny of a nation. The dragon ships were hungry, and Ragnar Lothbrok knew exactly where the feast was waiting. The problem with discovering a new world is that the old world suddenly feels incredibly small. Ragnar Lothbrok sat on the high seat of Kattegat, listening to the petty disputes of his subjects, but his mind was hundreds of miles away, drifting on the currents of the North Sea. The gold from Lindisfarne had bought him power, yes. It had bought him the earldom, a better house, and better furs to keep out the winter chill. But it had not brought him satisfaction. In fact, it had done the opposite. It had infected him with a permanent, itching restlessness. He looked at the rocky, unforgiving soil of Scandinavia, where a man had to break his back just to grow a few turnips, and he remembered the green, lush fields of England. He wasn't just thinking about plunder anymore. Plunder was a young man's game. Plunder was for buying beer and bracelets. Ragnar was starting to think about legacy. He was thinking about land. This was the great irony of the Viking Age, that the terrified monks never understood. The demons from the north were often just frustrated farmers looking for better real estate. Ragnar looked at his growing sons, looked at the crowded valleys of Norway, and did the math. There wasn't enough dirt to go around, but to the west, there was an entire island made of good dirt. The rumors had evolved into intelligence. Ragnar had spent the long winter evenings pouring drinks for travelers, merchants, and wanderers, buying their stories with mead. He learned that England was not just one kingdom. It was a fractured puzzle of 7 kingdoms, the Heptarchy. Lindisfarne was in Northumbria, the north, but the travelers spoke of a kingdom to the south called Wessex. They said it was richer, warmer, and ruled by a king named Ecbert, who had spent time in the court of Charlemagne. They said this king was different, clever, cultured, dangerous. To Ragnar, this didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a personal invitation. The preparations for the new expedition were different this time. There was no secrecy. The whole of Kattegat knew they were going. The sound of hammers on wood echoed from dawn until dusk as Floki and his shipwrights expanded the fleet. They weren't taking one ship, they were taking 3. It was a small flotilla by later standards, but for the time it was a significant projection of force. It represented a massive investment of capital. If these ships sank, the economy of Kattegat would essentially collapse. Ragnar was pushing all his chips into the center of the table. Recruiting was no longer difficult. After the first raid, men were practically lining up on the beach, begging to be taken along. Veterans showed off their scars. Young boys tried to look older and tougher than they were. Ragnar chose carefully. He didn't just want muscle, he wanted discipline. He chose men who could row for 12 hours straight without complaining. He chose men who could form a shield wall and hold it while screaming maniacally. And of course, he took his brother Rollo, because keeping your friends close is smart, but keeping your jealous, incredibly violent brother where you can see him is genius. Athelstan, the monk captured during the first raid, had become a strange fixture in Ragnar's household. He was a slave, yes, but he was also a pet intellectual. Ragnar kept him not for labor, but for his brain. He asked him endless questions about the Christian God, about the kings, about the geography. Athelstan, torn between his faith and his survival, and perhaps a growing case of Stockholm Syndrome, provided the keys to the cultural kingdom. He explained that the Christians worshipped a dead man on a cross. Ragnar found this hilarious and confusing. Why didn't he fight back? Ragnar would ask. He chose to die, Athelstan would reply. Ragnar would just shake his head. A god who chose to die seemed like a terrible strategic ally, but he listened. He learned. He was downloading the operating system of his enemy. The departure was a festival. The 3 ships were dragged into the surf, their dragon heads gleaming with fresh paint and tallow. The sails, striped in red and white wool, were hoisted. The entire village stood on the shoreline. Lagertha stood there too, her face a mask of stoic pride, though her eyes were hard. She was staying behind to rule. Someone had to make sure the neighbors didn't invade while the army was away. It was the burden of the responsible partner. She watched the ships diminish until they were just specks against the grey horizon. Then she turned back to the Great Hall to deal with the mountain of administrative paperwork Ragnar had happily abandoned. The crossing was brutal. The North Sea is not a body of water. It is a mood disorder. It changes from calm to homicidal in the span of an hour. For days, the 3 ships were tossed like toys in a bathtub. The waves were grey walls of water that crashed over the gunwales, soaking the men to the bone. There is no misery quite like being wet, cold, and seasick in an open boat with 50 other men who haven't bathed recently. The smell was a potent cocktail of unwashed bodies, wet wool, bilge water, and fear. Navigation was a constant stress. There was no GPS, no compass in the modern sense. They navigated by the sun, the stars, the flight of birds, and the color of the water. Floki's sunstone, a crystal of Iceland spar, allowed them to locate the sun even through the thick overcast, polarizing the light. It was magic to the crew, but technology to the captain. Ragnar stood at the steering oar, eyes red from the salt spray, scanning the horizon. He had to project absolute confidence. If he looked lost, the panic would spread faster than a plague. "We are on course," he would say, even when he had absolutely no idea where they were. Fake it until you make it. A strategy as old as leadership itself. Then the water changed color. It shifted from the deep, bruised purple of the deep ocean to a lighter, silty green. Seaweed appeared, birds, and then the white cliffs. They had drifted further south than Lindisfarne, much further south. They were approaching the coast of Wessex. The landscape here was different. It was softer, greener, more rolling. To the eyes of men used to the jagged granite of Norway, it looked like a garden. It looked vulnerable. They beached the ships in a quiet estuary, the keels grinding into the mud. The silence after weeks of wind and waves was jarring. The birds sang. The air smelled of loam and flowers, not salt and ice. The Vikings disembarked, their legs stiff, their hands gripping their axes. They were in enemy territory, but it didn't feel like a war zone. It felt like a park. Their first encounter with the locals was almost comical. A group of Saxon peasants was working in a field, harvesting grain. They looked up to see huge bearded men covered in tattoos and leather armor walking out of the mist. The peasants froze. They had heard stories of the Northmen, but stories are different from reality. The reality was terrifyingly large and smelled heavily of the sea. The peasants dropped their scythes and ran. The Vikings watched them go, laughing. It was a clash of two worlds, one that lived for war and one that just wanted to get the harvest in before it rained. But Wessex was not Northumbria. King Ecbert was not a monk who would just pray while his house burned down. Ecbert had a standing army, or at least a well-organized militia. Signals were lit. Riders were dispatched. The heathen army had been spotted. Ragnar led his men inland, moving with the cautious arrogance of an apex predator. They found a village. Small thatched roofs, a wooden church. They raided it, of course, that was the protocol. They took the grain, the livestock, and anything that glittered. But Ragnar was looking for something else. He was looking for the authority. He wanted to know who was in charge. They didn't have to wait long. A Saxon patrol, led by a local ealdorman, intercepted them on a ridge. The Saxons were disciplined. They wore helmets and mail. They carried kite shields and spears. They formed a shield wall, clashing their weapons against their shields, shouting "Out, out!" in their strange, barking language. Ragnar watched them form up. He was fascinated. They fought in lines, like the Romans he had heard stories about. They were rigid. The Vikings were fluid. "Shield wall!" Ragnar bellowed. His men locked their round shields together, creating a scale-like barrier of wood and iron. The clash was violent and short. The Saxons were brave, but they were fighting for their king. The Vikings were fighting for their lives and their entry into Valhalla. There is a difference in motivation there. Ragnar fought at the front, his axe moving with a terrifying efficiency. He didn't hack mindlessly. He looked for the gaps. He hooked a shield, pulled it down, and struck. It was mechanics. It was physics applied to biology. The Vikings broke the Saxon line. The retreat turned into a rout. But Ragnar ordered his men to stop. He didn't want to chase them all down. He wanted survivors. He wanted them to go back to their king and tell him who had arrived. He was sending a message. We are here, and we are not going away. That night, they camped on the high ground. They roasted the sheep they had stolen. The mood was high. They had touched land, they had fought, and they had won. But Ragnar sat apart from the fire, staring into the darkness of the English countryside. Athelstan sat near him, looking miserable. "This king?" Ragnar asked, chewing on a piece of mutton. "Ecbert. Tell me about him." Athelstan hesitated. "He is like you," the monk said softly. Ragnar looked at him, surprised. "Like me? Is he a warrior?" "He is a man of ambition," Athelstan explained. "He spent time at the court of the Emperor Charlemagne. He learned how to govern, how to build, how to conquer. He is not like the other Saxon kings. He thinks." Ragnar smiled. A slow, predatory smile. Finally, an opponent who could play chess, not just checkers. "Good," he said. "I was getting tired of fighting sheep." The invasion of Wessex was not going to be a simple raid. Ragnar realized that. The land was too rich, the organization too deep. If they stayed, they would be ground down. But if they could strike a deal, if they could use their violence as leverage. The next day, a rider approached their camp. He did not carry a weapon. He carried a white flag. He was an envoy from King Ecbert. The Saxons were learning. They realized that perhaps they couldn't just kill these invaders. Perhaps they had to talk to them. The envoy, a nervous man in a velvet cloak that looked ridiculously impractical for the mud, was brought before Ragnar. He spoke in a dialect Athelstan had to translate. King Ecbert sends his greetings, Athelstan translated, his voice trembling slightly. He asks why you have come to his land and disturbed his peace. Ragnar stood up, wiping grease from his beard. He walked up to the envoy, invading his personal space until the man flinched. Ragnar looked him up and down, inspecting the velvet, the soft hands, the fear. "Tell your king," Ragnar said, his voice low and amused, "that I have not come to disturb his peace. I have come to see what his peace is worth." He gestured to the pile of looted silver and weapons. "Tell him we are just tourists, very aggressive tourists, and we are looking for souvenirs." The envoy scurried away like a frightened rabbit. The Vikings laughed, but Ragnar didn't. He knew the game had just changed. King Ecbert hadn't sent an army. He had sent a question. That meant he was calculating. He was assessing the threat. Ragnar looked at the rolling green hills of Wessex. He bent down and picked up a handful of earth. He rubbed it between his fingers. It was dark, rich, full of life. It didn't crumble like the dry dust of the north. You could grow anything here. You could grow a future here. This was the call of the West. It wasn't the gold in the monasteries. That was just the bait. The real prize was the dirt under his boots. Ragnar knew that his people couldn't live on fish and granite forever. They needed this, and he was going to get it for them, even if he had to burn down every castle in Wessex to do it. But he also knew, with the instinct of a man who has survived too many winters, that this Ecbert would be a problem. A smart enemy is always worse than a strong one. A strong enemy you can outsmart. A smart enemy might just outsmart you. As the fires of the Viking camp burned in the English night, strange shadows danced against the trees. The local wolves howled, but they sounded different from the wolves at home. Everything was different. Ragnar lay down on his furs, his hand resting on the hilt of his axe. He closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He was planning. The raid was over. The invasion had begun. And somewhere in a stone castle miles away, King Ecbert was likely doing the exact same thing. The board was set. The first move had been made. Now it was time to see how the Saxon king played the game. Ambition is a strange addiction. For a normal man, raiding England and returning with a boatload of silver would be enough to retire. He would buy a nice farm, commission a comfortable chair, and spend the rest of his days telling exaggerated stories to his grandchildren. But Ragnar Lothbrok was not a normal man, and he was certainly not interested in retirement. The success in Wessex had not satisfied his hunger. It had merely expanded his appetite. He looked at the map of the known world, a map that was becoming increasingly detailed in his mind, and he realized that England was just the appetizer. The main course was waiting on the continent. The rumors of Francia had been drifting north for years. Traders spoke of a land ruled by the grandsons of the great Charlemagne, a land of stone cities, paved roads, and churches that made the English monasteries look like garden sheds. And at the heart of this empire lay a city that was whispered about with a mix of reverence and greed: Paris. To the Vikings, Paris was almost mythical. It was described as an island of stone in the middle of a river, filled with more wealth than all the markets of the north combined. It was the jewel of the West, and Ragnar decided he was going to wear it. The preparation for this expedition was unlike anything Kattegat had ever seen. This was not a raid, it was an invasion. In the spring of the year 845, the harbor was so choked with ships that you could practically walk across the fjord without getting your feet wet. Ragnar had assembled a fleet of 120 longships, 5,000 men. It was a floating city of violence. The logistics alone were a nightmare. Feeding 5,000 men requires a mountain of dried fish and enough beer to float a battleship. But the mood was electric. The name Ragnar had become a currency more valuable than gold. If he said they were going to sail to the moon, half the men would have started packing warm clothes without asking questions. However, the target was not just a city, it was an empire. The Frankish Empire was currently ruled by Charles the Bald. History has been somewhat unkind to Charles regarding his nickname. Historians still debate if he was actually bald, or if it was an ironic joke because he was hairy, or perhaps because he lacked land inheritance initially. Regardless of his hair situation, Charles was a man with a lot of problems. His grandfather Charlemagne had unified Europe. Charles and his brothers were busy tearing it apart in a series of civil wars. A fractured empire is a Viking's favorite playground. Ragnar knew that Charles was busy fighting his siblings, which meant the back door to Paris was left unlocked. The fleet set sail in March. The sheer visual impact of 120 dragon heads cutting through the North Sea must have been terrifying. It was a psychological weapon. When they entered the mouth of the Seine River, the local fishermen didn't just run, they probably reconsidered their entire theology. The Seine was the artery of the Frankish kingdom, a winding, sluggish river that led directly to the heart of the king's power. Sailing up a river is very different from sailing on the ocean. On the ocean, you are hidden by the vastness. On a river, you are on a stage. The Franks could see them coming for miles, but seeing them and stopping them were two very different things. The Vikings moved with a terrifying speed. They rowed against the current, the rhythmic beat of the drums echoing off the riverbanks. They raided as they went, of course. Rouen was the first major casualty. The city was sacked with a brutal efficiency that sent shockwaves down the river. The smoke from the burning buildings acted as a signal fire, warning Paris that something wicked was coming. Ragnar stood at the prow of the lead ship, watching the French countryside roll by. It was lush, green, and incredibly wealthy. Every monastery they passed was a piñata waiting to be smashed, but Ragnar forbade the men from getting too distracted. The prize is ahead, he told them. He didn't want them weighed down with loot before they reached the capital. He needed them hungry. As they pushed deeper inland, the resistance began to materialize. Charles the Bald was not an idiot, although his military strategy leaves something to be desired. He assembled an army to block the Viking advance. He positioned his troops on the banks of the Seine to prevent the Northmen from landing. It was a sound plan on paper. Unfortunately, Charles made a critical tactical error, the kind of mistake that ends up in military textbooks under the chapter What Not to Do. He divided his forces. He put half his army on one side of the river and half on the other. He assumed this would trap the Vikings in the middle. Ragnar, looking at this deployment, must have laughed until his ribs hurt. By splitting his army, Charles had essentially given Ragnar the option to attack whichever half he wanted, while the other half could only watch helplessly from the opposite bank. The Seine is a wide river. You cannot swim across it in armor to help your friends. Ragnar chose the side with the smaller force. The battle that followed was less of a contest and more of a demonstration. The Vikings stormed the bank, screaming their war cries, crashing into the Frankish line with the force of a landslide. The Franks were used to fighting civilized wars against other Franks. They were not prepared for men who fought with axes, who bit their shields, and who seemed to have no concept of self-preservation. The result was a massacre. But it was what happened after the battle that truly cemented the horror. Ragnar wanted to send a message to Paris. He wanted them to know that resistance was not just futile, it was painful. He ordered the execution of 111 prisoners in full view of the Frankish army on the other side of the river. And he didn't just execute them, he sacrificed them to Odin. They were hanged on an island in the middle of the river. Imagine being a Frankish soldier on the safe bank. You watch your comrades being slaughtered, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. You can't cross the river. You can't shoot that far. You just have to watch. The psychological impact was devastating. The remaining Frankish army didn't just retreat, they evaporated. Their morale was broken before the siege of Paris had even begun. Ragnar had won the battle for the mind, which is usually more important than the battle for the ground. With the path cleared, the fleet continued upriver. The tension on the ships began to rise. They were hundreds of miles from the sea now. If they were trapped here, there was no escape. They were deep in the belly of the beast. The river narrowed, the forests closed in, but Ragnar remained calm. He knew that fear was a tool, and he was currently the one wielding it. And then, on the morning of Easter Sunday, because Ragnar had a flair for dramatic timing, they rounded a bend in the river, and there it was, Paris. It wasn't the sprawling metropolis of today. In the 9th century, Paris was concentrated on the Ile de la Cité, the island in the middle of the Seine. It was a fortress city, surrounded by Roman walls that had stood for centuries. 2 bridges connected it to the mainland, heavily fortified. Stone towers rose into the sky. Church bells were ringing frantically, sounding the alarm. To the Vikings, who lived in wooden longhouses, it looked like a mountain made of stone. The men in the ships fell silent. They had never seen anything like this. The sheer scale of the engineering was intimidating. How do you attack a city that floats in the middle of a river wrapped in stone? Doubt began to creep in. "It's too big," some muttered. "We can't breach those walls." Ragnar sensed the hesitation. He walked down the length of his ship, looking each man in the eye. He didn't make a speech about glory or gods. He pointed at the city. "Look at the panic," he said softly. "They are hiding behind their walls because they are afraid of you. Stone does not fight back, men do, and their men are already beaten." He was right. Inside the city, chaos reigned. The refugees from the countryside had flooded into Paris, bringing stories of the demons who hung men from trees. The monks were praying, the merchants were burying their gold, and the soldiers were looking at the river with dread. Charles the Bold was inside the city, or nearby at the Abbey of St. Denis, frantically trying to figure out how to save his capital. He had lost his army. He had lost his nerve. All he had left were walls. Ragnar ordered the ships to spread out. He didn't attack immediately. He let the fleet drift closer, letting the current do the work. He wanted the people of Paris to get a good look at them. He wanted them to count the ships. 120, 5,000 men. He wanted them to do the math and realize the answer was 0 survival. The siege of Paris was about to begin. But for Ragnar, the victory was already half won. He had proven that the great Frankish Empire was a paper tiger. He had sailed into the heart of Europe, and no one had been able to stop him. As he looked at the stone towers of the Ile de la Cité, he didn't feel fear. He felt a profound sense of validation. The farmer from Kattegat was about to knock on the door of the successor to Rome. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the river. The torches on the Viking ships were lit, creating a ring of fire around the city. The chanting began, a low rhythmic thrumming of wood on shields. Inside the city, the Easter Mass was being celebrated, but the prayers were drowned out by the sound of the north. Ragnar turned to Floki, who was giggling maniacally at the sight of the terrified Christians. "Tomorrow," Ragnar said, "we go to church." The audacity of the moment cannot be overstated. This was the equivalent of a pirate fleet sailing up the Potomac to shell Washington, D.C. It shouldn't have been possible. It violated every rule of warfare and geography. But Ragnar Lothbrok operated on a different set of rules. He operated on the belief that if you hit someone hard enough and fast enough, reality would bend to your will. The first arrows began to fly from the walls, falling short of the ships. Ragnar didn't even flinch. He just watched the arc of the arrows, calculating the range. He knew the bridges were the key. If he could take the bridges, the city would starve. Or if he could breach the walls, the city would bleed. But there was another option, the option that Charles the Bold was already considering in his panic. The option of tribute, Darngeld, the idea that you could pay the monster to go away. Ragnar knew that gold was heavy, but blood was heavier. He preferred the gold, but he was perfectly willing to spill the blood to get it. As the night settled over the Seine, the siege of Paris entered its waiting phase. The predator was circling the prey. The history of France was about to be rewritten by a man who couldn't even read. The conquest had begun. The sun rose over the Seine on Easter Sunday in the year 845, but it did not bring the promise of resurrection. It brought the certainty of violence. The fog that clung to the river began to lift, revealing the nightmare waiting at the gates. To the citizens of Paris huddled behind the Roman walls of the Ile de la Cité, the sight was paralyzing. The river was choked with dragon ships. The water itself seemed to have disappeared beneath a carpet of wood and shields. The silence of the dawn was broken not by church bells, but by the rhythmic, guttural chanting of 5,000 men who were about to try and tear the city apart with their bare hands. Ragnar Lothbrok stood on the deck of his flagship, inspecting the defenses. Paris was a hard nut to crack. The island was a natural fortress surrounded by the fast-flowing currents of the Seine. The two bridges connecting it to the mainland, the Grand Pont and the Petit Pont, were heavily fortified with stone towers. To take the city, they had to take the bridges. Ragnar knew that charging a stone tower across a narrow wooden bridge was a fantastic way to die quickly. It was a bottleneck, a kill zone where numbers didn't matter. 1,000 men could be held off by 50 if the 50 were stubborn enough, but Ragnar had a plan. He didn't intend to play by the rules of siege warfare. He didn't have siege engines, catapults, or trebuchets. He had terror, and he had speed. The attack began with a roar that reportedly shook the mortar in the walls. The Vikings did not advance in orderly lines like the Roman legions of old. They swarmed. They poured off the ships onto the banks and the bridges like a colony of army ants. The Frankish defenders, stationed in the towers, rained down arrows, stones, and boiling oil. The air filled with the scream of dying men and the crack of wood splintering. But for every Viking who fell, 3 more stepped over his body. They were fueled by a frenzy that the Christian soldiers could not comprehend. This was the berserker rage, a trance-like state where pain was irrelevant and fear was non-existent. Ragnar moved through the chaos, commanding not from the rear, but from the front. He saw the Grand Pont holding firm. The Franks had blocked the end with heavy timber and iron chains. Ragnar signaled to the flank. A group of his men had dragged smaller boats onto the land, bypassing the bridge entirely, and were launching them upstream to attack the island from the rear. It was an encirclement. The defenders on the bridge heard the screams behind them and realized, with a sinking feeling in their stomachs, that they were fighting a battle they had already lost. The city began to panic. The Vikings breached the outer defenses. They were now at the foot of the walls. They hammered at the gates with battering rams made from the trunks of felled oaks. The sound was a steady, rhythmic thundering, doom, doom, doom. Inside the churches, the priests prayed harder, asking God why he had sent these demons on his holiest day. The answer, unfortunately, was that the demons had better boats. However, just as victory seemed inevitable, an enemy appeared that Ragnar could not hit with an axe. It started slowly, a few men collapsing, not from wounds, but from cramps. Then the vomiting began, then the fever. A plague, likely dysentery, exacerbated by the crowded conditions and the poor sanitation of a siege camp, swept through the Viking ranks like a wildfire. This is the great equalizer of history. You can be the greatest warrior in the world, stronger than a bear and faster than a wolf, but a microscopic bacterium does not care. It will kill a king as easily as it kills a slave. Ragnar watched his invincible army begin to dissolve. Men who had laughed at Frankish arrows were now curled up in the mud, groaning in agony. The morale, which had been stratospheric, plummeted. The Vikings were superstitious. They interpreted this sudden sickness not as biology, but as theology. "The Christ God is fighting back," they whispered. "We have angered the spirits of this land." Even Ragnar, with all his skepticism, felt a flicker of doubt. Was this the price of hubris? Meanwhile, inside the Abbey of Saint-Denis, King Charles the Bald was having a panic attack of his own. He didn't know about the plague in the Viking camp. All he knew was that his army was gone, his capital was besieged, and the Northmen were literally banging on the front door. Charles was a pragmatist. He realized that he could not win a military victory. If the Vikings took the city, they would burn it to the ground. They would destroy the trade, the archives, and the legitimacy of his reign. He had to save Paris, even if it meant losing his dignity. He decided to do something that would change the economy of Europe for centuries. He decided to pay. The negotiation was a surreal piece of theater. Ragnar, hiding the fact that half his army was currently running to the latrines, met with the Frankish envoys. The Franks, terrified and desperate, saw only the fierce warlord who had hanged their comrades. They didn't see the exhaustion in his eyes. Ragnar played the highest stakes poker game of his life. He demanded a tribute so large it sounded like a joke. 7,000 livres, pounds, of silver and gold. To put this in perspective, this was an astronomical sum. It was nearly 3 tons of precious metal. It was enough to bankrupt the kingdom for years. It was essentially the entire liquid capital of the Frankish Empire. The envoys gasped. They tried to haggle. Ragnar simply pointed to the city walls and sharpened his axe. "The price is for the stone," he might have said. "If you want to keep the stones standing, you pay for them." King Charles accepted. He ordered the churches stripped. Reliquaries were melted down. The nobility was taxed. The peasantry was squeezed. The wealth of an empire was funneled into chests and carted out to the Viking camp. The scene of the payment was historic. The Vikings, many of them still pale and shaky from the sickness, watched as cart after cart of silver rolled into their camp. They had never seen this much wealth in one place. It was more than they could have raided in a lifetime. They realized then that Ragnar was a genius. Raiding was hard work. You had to fight, run, and carry things. Extortion. Extortion was efficient. You just stood there and looked scary, and the enemy brought the wealth to you. This payment became known as the Danegeld, literally Dane gold. It was protection money. Ragnar promised that in exchange for the silver, he would leave Paris unharmed and return home. Charles the Bald likely breathed a sigh of relief, thinking he had solved the problem. He was wrong. He hadn't solved the problem. He had fed it. By paying Ragnar, he taught the Vikings a very dangerous lesson. The threat of violence is more profitable than violence itself, and once you pay the blackmailer, he never really goes away. He just goes home to spend the money and plan his next visit. The departure from Paris was a strange mix of triumph and funeral procession. The ships were so heavy with silver that they sat dangerously low in the water. The men were rich beyond their wildest dreams. A common rower now had enough silver to buy a farm, a ship, and probably a small title back home. But the sickness was still with them. They left a trail of graves along the Seine as they rowed back to the sea. The conquest of Paris had been a success, but the gods had extracted their own tax in blood. Ragnar stood at the stern of the lead ship, watching the towers of Paris fade into the mist. He had done what no one thought possible. He had brought the Frankish Empire to its knees without fighting a final climatic battle. He had turned the Emperor Charlemagne's legacy into his personal ATM. But as he touched the cold silver in the chest beside him, he felt a strange hollowness. The mystery of the West was gone. He had seen the great cities, and he had seen the fear in their kings' eyes. They were not gods. They were just men with better architects. The veil had been lifted. The journey home was quiet. The men were too sick or too awed by their wealth to celebrate. They rode with the steady mechanical rhythm of professionals. When they finally reached the open sea, the fresh salt air seemed to cleanse the sickness from the ships. The coast of Francia disappeared and the prow turned north. Ragnar knew that he was returning to a different world. He was no longer just an earl or a king. He was the man who sacked Paris. The fame would be suffocating. Every young warrior in Scandinavia would want to sail with him. Every rival king would want to kill him. The target on his back had grown as large as his reputation, and there was something else. A thought that nagged at him. He had taken their gold, but he hadn't taken their land. The soil of Francia was just as rich as the soil of England. Why should they just take the fruit when they could own the orchard? The idea of settlement, of colonization, began to take root in his mind. The age of raiding was peaking. The age of conquest was approaching. As the familiar cliffs of Kattegat came into view, Ragnar didn't feel like a hero returning home. He felt like a man who had started a fire that would burn long after he was dead. The 7,000 pounds of silver would transform Kattegat. It would build fleets, armies, and palaces, but it would also bring envy, greed, and war. He looked at the silver again. It shone with a cold, seductive light. "Power is dangerous," he whispered to the wind, "but it is the only thing worth having." The conquest of Paris was over. The legend of Ragnar Lothbrok was now set in stone, as permanent as the walls he had threatened to destroy. But the gods are fond of irony. The gold that made him the greatest king in the north would also be the weight that eventually dragged him down. For now, however, the sun was shining, the wind was at his back, and he was the richest man in the world. Time is the one enemy that no axe can kill. Decades had passed since the glorious return from Paris, and the world had moved on, as it always does. Ragnar Lothbrok was no longer the young, hungry farmer looking at the horizon with wild ambition. He was now an old man, his beard grey and heavy like the winter frost, his skin mapped with the scars of 100 battles. He sat on his throne in Kattegat, but the throne felt harder than it used to. The great hall was filled with noise, but it was the noise of a new generation. His sons, Bjorn, Ivar, Ubbe, Hvitserk, and Sigurd, were grown men now. They were famous, they were dangerous, and in the hushed whispers of the market, people said they were greater than their father. This is the tragedy of every great man. Eventually you become a monument to your own past. Ragnar could feel the irrelevance creeping in like cold water in a leaking ship. He did not want to die in a bed, coughing his life away while women wiped his brow. That was the straw death, the ultimate shame for a Viking. He wanted to die screaming, with a sword in his hand and the roar of battle in his ears. But where was the battle? The neighbors were pacified. The Franks were paying tribute. The world was too quiet. And so, in a decision that historians and psychiatrists are still trying to unpack, Ragnar decided to go back to England. But he did not summon the great fleet. He did not call the banners of the north. He announced that he would sail to Northumbria, the kingdom of his old enemy, King Aela, with only 2 ships. It was madness. It was suicide. It was arrogance so profound, it looked like a death wish. 2 ships against an entire kingdom? His friends tried to stop him. His wives, past and present, told him he was insane. But Ragnar was stubborn. Perhaps he believed his own legend too much. Perhaps he thought the gods would protect him simply because he was Ragnar. Or perhaps deep down, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was crafting the final chapter of his saga. He knew that a glorious death would ignite his son's fury in a way that a peaceful life never could. He was not just planning an invasion, he was planning a legacy. The crossing was cursed from the start. The weather in the North Sea turned violent, as if the gods were trying to warn him, or perhaps wash their hands of him. The storms battered the 2 lonely ships. These were not the calm waters of his youth. The waves were mountains of grey water that crashed down with the weight of judgment. The wind tore the sails. The wood groaned and snapped. They were shipwrecked on the coast of Northumbria. It was a disastrous arrival. No surprise attack, no glorious landing. Just wet, shivering men crawling out of the surf onto a hostile beach, their ship smashed to kindling behind them. They were stranded in enemy territory, soaking wet, outnumbered, and with no way home. Most men would have surrendered. Ragnar Lothbrok just checked the edge of his axe and smiled. "Well," he might have said to the handful of survivors, "at least we don't have to row back." King Aela of Northumbria had been waiting for this moment for years. He was a pious man, a hard man, and he had never forgiven the Vikings for the humiliation of the past raids. When the scouts reported that the great Ragnar Lothbrok was shipwrecked on his coast with a skeleton crew, Aela likely fell to his knees and thanked God. He saw it as divine intervention. The devil had been delivered to his doorstep. Aela summoned his army, not a patrol, not a sheriff's posse, but a full army. He was not taking any chances. He marched toward the coast to meet the shipwrecked Vikings. The battle that followed was not a strategic masterpiece. It was a brawl. Ragnar and his survivors formed a shield wall, a small circle of defiance against a sea of Saxon steel. They fought with the ferocity of trapped wolves. Ragnar, old as he was, moved with a terrifying grace. He cut through the Saxon ranks, howling the names of the gods, laughing at the sheer absurdity of it all. For a moment it seemed like the myth might actually overpower the math. Maybe he could win. Maybe he could kill them all. But numbers are stubborn things. The Saxons came in wave after wave. The Vikings fell one by one until only Ragnar was left standing. He was surrounded, bleeding from a dozen wounds, breathing heavy, his axe notched and dull from the slaughter. The Saxons hesitated. They were afraid to approach him. He looked less like a man and more like a demon that refused to be exorcised. Finally, they overwhelmed him. They rushed him from all sides, burying him under the weight of shields and bodies. They stripped him of his armor. They bound his hands. They dragged him before King Aela. The meeting between the 2 kings was a study in contrast. Aela, dressed in fine silks and polished armor, sat on his horse, looking down with a mixture of triumph and fear. Ragnar, bloody, dirty, and bound, looked up with utter contempt. He did not beg. He did not ask for mercy. He stared at Aela until the English king looked away. "You are just a man," Aela said, trying to convince himself. "And you are just a temporary inconvenience," Ragnar likely thought, though he stayed silent. Aela wanted to break him. He wanted Ragnar to recant his pagan gods. He wanted him to apologize for the years of terror, but Ragnar said nothing. His silence was louder than a scream. It denied Aela the satisfaction of victory. It transformed the capture into a contest of wills, and even in chains, Ragnar was winning. Frustrated and terrified by this unbreaking pagan, Aela devised a method of execution that was designed to be the ultimate humiliation. He would not give Ragnar a warrior's death by the sword. That was too honorable. He would not hang him. That was too common. He ordered a pit to be dug, a deep, dark, damp pit. And he ordered his soldiers to collect snakes, hundreds of them, adders, vipers, anything that slithered and bit. The snake pit is one of the most iconic images in history, hovering on the border between fact and folklore. It represents the collision of the Christian desire to crush the serpent, the devil, and the Viking reality of a brutal earthen death. They dragged Ragnar to the edge of the pit. The sound from below was a dry, rasping hiss, like the sound of dead leaves blowing over stone. The smell was acrid. Ragnar looked down. He saw the writhing mass of coils. It was a nightmare made real. For a Viking who prized the open sky and the clean death of combat, this was a horror. To die in a hole, bitten by vermin, was a fate reserved for cowards and criminals. But this was Ragnar's final masterstroke. He realized that the manner of his death would determine the future of his vengeance. If he died quietly, he would be forgotten. If he died defiantly, he would become a martyr. He looked at Aella, who was watching from a safe distance, and he delivered the lines that would doom the kingdom of Northumbria. "It gladdens me to know that Odin's benches are preparing for a feast," Ragnar shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the castle. "Soon I shall be drinking ale from curved horns. The hero that comes into Valhalla does not lament his death. I shall not enter Odin's hall with fear." The soldiers pushed him. Ragnar fell into the darkness. He hit the bottom hard. The snake struck immediately. He felt the sharp, needle-like pain of fangs sinking into his legs, his arms, his chest. The venom burned like liquid fire. It was an agony that is hard to imagine, a slow, chemical dismantling of the nervous system. But Ragnar did not scream. He laughed. It was a wet, gurgling laugh, but it was a laugh. He looked up at the circle of light far above, where Ayla's face peered down. And then he said the words that would haunt the English for a generation. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. It was a prophecy. The old boar was Ragnar. The little piglets were his sons. He was telling Ayla in the plainest terms possible, "You think you are ending this. You are just starting it. You have killed the father, but you have unleashed the sons, and they are going to come for you." The venom did its work. Ragnar's vision blurred. The cold of the pit seeped into his bones, replacing the fire of the poison. His heart, which had pumped with the rhythm of the ocean for 60 years, began to slow. In those final moments, as the darkness closed in, Ragnar likely did not think of the snakes. He thought of the smell of the salt spray on the Kattegat. He thought of the sun rising over the English hills that first morning. He thought of Lagerta's blue eyes and the way she held a shield. He thought of the friends he had lost, Floki's giggles, Athelstan's quiet prayers. He died alone in the dark in the year 865. Up above, King Aella ordered the pit covered. He probably went to dinner. He probably drank wine and accepted the congratulations of his lords. "The beast is dead," they said. "The Northmen will never trouble us again." They were wrong. They were catastrophically, historically wrong. Ragnar Lothbrok was dead, but the idea of Ragnar Lothbrok had just achieved immortality. His death was not a conclusion. It was a catalyst. When the news of the snake pit reached Kattegat, it did not bring grief. It brought a cold, focused rage that the world had never seen before. The death of Ragnar was the end of the age of raiding and the beginning of the age of invasion. He had sacrificed himself to give his people a casus belli, a cause for war. He had given them a reason to stop looking for gold and start looking for land and blood. The wind howled over the Northumbrian coast that night. To the superstitious Saxons, it sounded like the weeping of demons. To the Vikings, it sounded like the Valkyries coming down to carry a soul home. The gates of Valhalla were swinging open. The tables were set. The mead was poured. The king was coming home. But back on Earth, the storm was just gathering. The pigs were about to grunt, and the walls of York would shake with the fury of the payback. Ragnar had played his final hand, and even from the grave, he had checked the king. When King Aelle threw Ragnar Lothbrok into a pit of vipers, he believed he was burying a problem. In reality, he was planting a seed. It is a common mistake among medieval monarchs to assume that killing a charismatic leader kills the movement he started. History, however, suggests the opposite. Killing the man usually sanctifies the mission. Aelle went to sleep in his stone castle in Northumbria, secure in the knowledge that the old boar was dead. He did not hear the sound of the piglets grunting across the North Sea, but he would soon enough, and when he did, the sound would be louder than thunder. The news of Ragnar's death did not travel by letter or by royal decree. It traveled by the mysterious, almost telepathic network of the Viking world, whispered by traders, shouted from ship to ship, carried by the wind itself. When it reached Kattegat, the reaction was not the wailing of grief. There were no tears. There was a sudden, terrifying silence. It was the silence of a hurricane inhaling before it destroys the coast. Ragnar's sons were no longer children. They were warlords in their own right, each carrying a shard of their father's complex personality. Bjorn Ironside, the eldest, possessed Ragnar's strength and his ability to endure. He was a mountain of a man, stoic and immovable. Ubbi had his father's reason and his unexpected kindness. Hvitserk had his wanderlust. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, so named for the strange mark in his pupil, had his mysticism. And then there was Ivar. Ivar the Boneless is perhaps the most frightening figure in Viking history. Physically disabled, unable to walk without crutches or crawling, he should have been left to die at birth according to the harsh customs of the time. Instead, he grew into a genius of violence. He possessed Ragnar's cunning, but stripped of Ragnar's charm and amplified by a lifetime of pain. Where Ragnar fought for land and curiosity, Ivar seemed to fight because he enjoyed the sound of things breaking. He was the strategist, the manipulator, the monster under the bed that even the other Vikings checked for. When the brothers gathered to hear the details of their father's death, the pit, the snakes, the final prophecy, it was Ivar who stopped the others from launching a hasty, emotional raid. "We do not just go to kill Aelle," he might have argued, his eyes burning with a cold intelligence. "We go to end his world." They did not summon a raiding party. They summoned a migration. This is the moment the Viking Age shifted gears from annoying piracy to existential threat. The call went out to every fjord, every valley, every island in Scandinavia. Ragnar is dead. The boar has fallen. We are going to England not to steal, but to avenge. Warriors came from Sweden, from Norway, from Denmark. Rivals who had fought each other for decades laid down their grievances to join the banner. The prospect of looting England was tempting, but the prospect of being part of the greatest revenge story in history was irresistible. Historians call it the Great Heathen Army. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually quite reserved, simply refers to it as the Missal here, the Great Army. It was a force unlike anything Britain had ever seen. Estimates vary, but we are talking about thousands of men. 3,000? 5,000? In an age where armies often consisted of a few hundred guys named Steve fighting in a muddy field, this was a weapon of mass destruction. In the year 865, the horizon off the coast of East Anglia turned black with sails. Hundreds of ships. It looked as if the sea itself was invading the land. They did not land in Northumbria immediately. Ivar was too smart for that. He knew Aelle would be waiting. Instead, they landed in East Anglia, the kingdom to the south. They camped. They demanded horses from the locals. They waited. They spent the winter sharpening their axes, and letting the terror filter north. It was psychological warfare. They let Aelle sit in his castle for months, knowing they were there, knowing they were coming, letting the anticipation rot his courage from the inside out. When spring broke, the army moved north. They did not march. They flowed like lava. They moved on York, the great capital of the north. York was an old Roman city, its walls crumbling but still formidable. The Vikings took it on All Saints' Day, knowing the Saxons would be in church. It was a tactical masterstroke. While the Northumbrians were praying for salvation, the Vikings were climbing the walls to ensure they needed it. King Aelle and his rival, King Osbert, who had been fighting a civil war because, apparently, the English couldn't stop fighting each other, even during an alien invasion, finally decided to join forces. It was too little, too late. They marched on York to retake the city. The battle for York was a slaughter. The Vikings were not just raiders anymore, they were an occupying force. They used the Roman walls against the Saxons. They trapped the English army in the narrow streets of the city. It was a meat grinder. The fury of the Northmen was unleashed in a confined space. King Osbert was killed in the fighting, hacked down amidst the burning ruins of the city. But Aelle? No. They did not kill Aelle in the heat of battle. That would have been too kind. That would have been too quick. The sons of Ragnar had given strict orders. Take him alive. When the smoke cleared, the great heathen army stood victorious. York was theirs. The north was theirs. And King Aelle was dragged before the brothers. He was no longer the arrogant monarch who had stood over the snake pit. He was a broken man, covered in mud and the blood of his subjects. He looked up at the sons of the man he had murdered. He saw Bjorn's immovable face. He saw Ubbe's cold stare. And he saw Ivar smiling. What happened next is a subject of intense historical debate. The sagas describe a ritual known as the Blood Eagle. Some modern historians argue it is literary fiction, a mistranslation, or Viking propaganda designed to terrify enemies. But whether it happened literally or is just a metaphor for extreme brutality, it represents the emotional climax of the saga. The ritual was specific. It was dedicated to Odin. It was the ultimate offering of vengeance. The victim was placed prone. The ribs were severed from the spine with an axe, one by one. The lungs were pulled through the opening to resemble wings. It was a gruesome, horrific, anatomically precise dismantling of a human being. The sagas say Aelle suffered this fate. Imagine the scene. A grey English morning. The entire Viking army gathered in a circle, silent. The only sound is the wind and the heavy breathing of the executioner. Bjorn Ironside, the eldest son, likely held the blade. He was the executor of his father's will. This was not sadism for the sake of sadism. This was balance. Aelle had used snakes, creatures of the earth, low and crawling, to kill Ragnar. The sons used the eagle, a creature of the air, of Odin, to kill Aelle. They turned his lungs into wings so his spirit could fly to Odin and tell the Allfather that the debt was paid. The piglets have grunted. Ivar might have whispered as the deed was done. With Aelle dead, the vengeance was technically complete. A normal army would have packed up, loaded the ships with silver and gone home to boast. But the great heathen army did not leave. This is the crucial turning point. They looked at the green fields of Northumbria. They looked at the strong walls of York. They looked at the disorganized, terrified kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex to the south. Why go back? They asked. Why go back to the rocks and the ice when we can own this? Ragnar had dreamed of land. His sons were making it a reality. They installed a puppet king in Northumbria, a man who would do exactly what they said, and they turned their eyes south. The mission had mutated. It was no longer about a dead father. It was about a living empire. The brothers, however, were not a monolith. Success breeds conflict. Bjorn, having fulfilled his duty as the eldest, felt the pull of the Mediterranean, the desire to surpass his father's exploration. He wanted to see Rome. He wanted to see the sands of Africa. He was an explorer at heart, like Ragnar. Ivar, on the other hand, was a conqueror. He wanted to crush the remaining Saxon kingdoms. He wanted to break Mercia and Wessex. He loved the game of war too much to leave the table while there were still chips to be won. Ubbi wanted to farm. He wanted the land Ragnar had promised. This divergence of goals marked the end of the unified First Wave and the beginning of the Viking diaspora in England. But for a moment, standing over the corpse of King Aelle in the ruins of York, they were one. They were the wrath of the North made flesh. They had proven that the Scandinavian people were not just a nuisance on the edge of the map. They were a superpower. The news of Aelle's death sent shockwaves through Europe. The Blood Eagle became a horror story told to children from Paris to Rome. Do not anger the Northmen, kings told their advisors. Do not kill their leaders. It only makes them angrier. In Wessex, a young prince named Alfred, who would later be known as the Great, was watching these events with a growing sense of dread. He realized what the other Saxon kings did not. These Vikings were not leaving. They were bringing their wives. They were bringing their plows. They were changing the demographics of the island. The first wave had crashed over the seawall, and the water was not receding. For the sons of Ragnar, the death of Aelle was a closing of a chapter, but the opening of a much larger book. They had stepped out of their father's shadow. They were no longer just Ragnar's sons. They were kings in their own right. Bjorn Ironside would become the king of Sweden and a legend of the Mediterranean. Ivar the Boneless would become the king of Dublin and York, a tactician studied for centuries. Sigurd Snake in the Eye would found a dynasty that linked to the kings of Denmark. But on that day in York, amidst the smoke and the blood, they were just brothers. They had done the impossible. They had brought an empire to its knees to avenge one man. As the sun set over the conquered city of York, the ravens began to circle. Odin's birds, they came to feast. The prophecy of the old boar had been fulfilled. The piglets had not only grunted, they had torn the sty apart. The Viking Age had reached its zenith. The North was no longer just a place on a map. It was the master of the West. The first wave was over, but the tide was still rising, and to the south, the last kingdom of England, Wessex, stood alone against the coming storm. The war for the soul of Britain had just begun. If the death of King Aelle was the closing act of a revenge tragedy, what followed was the opening credit sequence of an empire-building simulator. The great heathen army had achieved its primary objective. The old boar had been avenged, the king of Northumbria had been carved into an eagle, and the blood debt was settled. A normal army, composed of sensible men who missed their wives and their own beds, would have declared victory, packed up the stolen silver, and sailed home to enjoy a retirement filled with inflation-causing spending sprees. But the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok were not sensible men, and they certainly were not interested in retirement. They looked at the map of Europe not as a finished painting, but as a blank canvas waiting for them to spill more red paint on it. The brotherhood that had united them for the revenge mission began to fracture under the weight of their individual ambitions. This is a universal law of bands, whether they are rock stars or Viking warlords. Once the big hit is released, the lead singers want to go solo. They had conquered the north of England, but the world was much larger than Yorkshire. The second wave of the Ragnarsson saga was about to begin, and it would see the brothers scattering to the four winds, each determined to outdo the other in glory, violence, and mileage. Bjorn Ironside, the eldest, felt the pull of the horizon most acridly. He looked at the grey, rainy skies of England and felt bored. He had heard stories, perhaps from his father, perhaps from captured travellers, of a sea far to the south. A sea where the water was blue, the sun was hot, and the cities were made of white marble and filled with gold that had never seen a Viking axe. The Mediterranean. To a Norseman, the Mediterranean was like a fable. It was the land of Rome, the center of the ancient world. Bjorn decided that he didn't just want to raid another muddy Saxon village, he wanted to raid history itself. In the year 859, Bjorn launched one of the most audacious naval expeditions of the Middle Ages. He teamed up with a legendary Viking chieftain named Hastein, a man whose mentorship was essentially a masterclass in piracy. Together, they led a fleet of 62 ships not across the North Sea but south. They sailed past the coast of Francia, which they had already terrorized, and rounded the peninsula of Spain. This was uncharted territory for Vikings. They were entering the sphere of influence of the Umayyad Caliphate, the Islamic rulers of Spain and North Africa. The clash between the Vikings and the Moors was a collision of two expanding superpowers. The Vikings, used to fighting static shield walls in the mud, suddenly found themselves facing fast cavalry, Greek fire, and a civilization that was mathematically and scientifically superior to anything in Europe. Did this stop Bjorn? Absolutely not. It just made the looting more interesting. They raided Algeciras. They raided the coast of Morocco, capturing blue men, North Africans, who they later sold in Ireland as exotic slaves. They sailed through the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, and entered the Mediterranean. It must have been a surreal experience. Imagine men used to the fjords of Norway seeing the olive groves of Italy. The light was different. The smell was different. Citrus and thyme instead of pine and rot. But the gold spent the same. Bjorn's ultimate target was Rome. He wanted to be the man who sacked the Eternal City. He wanted to sit on the Pope's chair and drink wine from St. Peter's cup. The fleet sailed up the coast of Italy and spotted a magnificent city glittering with white stone towers and formidable walls. Bjorn, checking his mental map, which was admittedly a bit fuzzy, declared, "That is Rome." It was not Rome. It was the city of Luna. But to a Viking who had never seen a city larger than a village, Luna looked close enough. The walls, however, were impregnable. The siege engines were back in the north. So Bjorn decided to pull a page from the Ragnar Lothbrok playbook. He used his brain instead of his bicep. He sent a messenger to the city gates. The messenger, weeping crocodile tears, told the Bishop of Luna that their great chieftain, Bjorn, had died. But on his deathbed, having seen the beauty of the Christian lands he had converted, his dying wish was to be buried in consecrated ground with a Christian mass. The bishop, thinking he had scored a massive theological victory, converting a Viking warlord, agreed. He opened the gates. The funeral procession entered the cathedral. The heavy wooden coffin was placed in the center of the nave. The bishop began the mass. The incense wafted through the air. The choir sang. And then the coffin lid flew open. Bjorn Ironside sat up, axe in hand, very much alive and very much pagan. He likely shouted something that translates to "surprise" before jumping out and hacking the bishop down. The hidden weapons were drawn. The mourners turned into berserkers. Luna fell in an afternoon. When Bjorn later realized that he had sacked Luna and not Rome, he was reportedly annoyed, but he got over it quickly. The gold was real, even if the geography was wrong. He had taken a Viking fleet into the heart of the Latin world and returned. He had proven that the reach of the Northmen was limitless. Meanwhile, back in England, Ivar the Boneless had no interest in olive groves or sunny beaches. Ivar was interested in the methodical dismantling of the Anglo-Saxon civilization. He remained the tactical brain of the great heathen army. While Bjorn was touring the Mediterranean, Ivar turned his eyes to East Anglia. King Edmund of East Anglia had been paying the Danegeld the protection money to keep the Vikings away. But Ivar decided that the lease had expired. In the year 869, the great army descended on East Anglia. King Edmund, a pious Christian, led his army out to meet them. It was a massacre. The Saxons were routed, and Edmund was captured. The interaction between Ivar and Edmund is another pillar of the Viking legend. Ivar, ever the sadist, offered Edmund a choice: renounce your Christ, become a vassal, and live. Edmund, aspiring to sainthood, refused. He said his faith was stronger than Viking steel. Ivar, smiling that terrifying smile, decided to test that hypothesis. According to the Passion of St. Edmund, the king was tied to a tree. The Vikings then used him for target practice. They shot arrows into him until, as the chroniclers wrote, he looked like a hedgehog. It was a brutal, slow execution designed to mock the Christian martyr ideal. When Edmund finally died, they beheaded him and threw his head into the thicket. The legend says a wolf guarded the head until his followers found it, shouting, "Hic, hic, hic, here, here, here." Whether the wolf spoke Latin is debatable, but the message Ivar sent was clear: your God cannot save you from us. Ivar did not stop there. He looked across the Irish Sea. Ireland was a chaotic mess of petty kings and warring tribes, a perfect environment for a man like him. He took a portion of the army and invaded Dublin. He didn't just raid it, he developed it. He established the Uí Emer dynasty, a lineage of Viking kings who would rule the Irish Sea for centuries. Ivar the Boneless, the cripple who could not walk, died a king of two lands, feared by every living soul in the British Isles. The Annals of Ulster recorded his death in 873 with a rare, respectful tone. Emer, king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain, ended his life. They didn't say how he died. Some say it was a sudden illness. Perhaps his brittle bones finally gave out. But he died in bed, wealthy and unconquered, which for Ivar was the ultimate victory over his own biology. While Bjorn was adventuring and Ivar was conquering, Ubbe took a different path. Ubbe was the pragmatic son. He looked at the devastation the war had caused and realized that you cannot eat gold. He wanted what Ragnar had originally wanted: land. After the conquest of Mercia, the central kingdom of England, Ubbe began to negotiate. He wasn't just a warlord, he was a politician. Ubbe realized that the great army was shrinking. Men were dying, getting old, or leaving with Bjorn and Ivar. He needed to consolidate. He fought against the rising star of Wessex, King Alfred, who was not yet great, just very stressed. The wars between Ubbe and Alfred were grinding and bloody. There were battles at Ashdown and Basing, but eventually a stalemate was reached. Ubbe was one of the architects of the Danelaw. This was the formal division of England. A line was drawn across the map, running roughly from London to Chester. Everything to the north and east was Viking territory, the Danelaw. Everything to the south and west was Saxon. In the Danelaw, Viking laws applied, Viking customs ruled, and most importantly, Vikings settled. This was the true second wave. It wasn't warriors jumping off ships with axes. It was warriors putting down their axes and picking up plows. They sent for their wives and children from Scandinavia. They married local Saxon women. They founded villages with names ending in by and Thorpe, Whitby, Scunthorpe, Derby. They became farmers. They integrated. Ubbe's legacy wasn't a mountain of skulls. It was a hybridization of culture. He proved that Vikings could build as well as they could destroy. And what of Sigurd Snake in the Eye? The son with the mark of the dragon in his eye returned to the roots. While his brothers tore up the map of Europe, Sigurd returned to Scandinavia. The homeland needed a ruler. With Ragnar dead, the power vacuum in Denmark was dangerous. Sigurd stepped in. He married the daughter of King Aella, a move of supreme irony or supreme political brilliance. uniting the blood of the executioner and the victim. Sigurd became the anchor. While the empire expanded outward, he ensured that the center held. From his line would descend the future kings of Denmark, including Gorm the Old and Harald Bluetooth. He represents the continuity of the dynasty. He was the one who kept the hearth fire burning, while the others were out setting the world on fire. The second wave changed the DNA of Europe forever. Before this, the Vikings were external threats, monsters who came from the sea and left. After the sons of Ragnar, the Vikings were internal. They were the neighbors. They were the kings. They were the ancestors. Bjorn had opened the Mediterranean to the north, creating trade routes that would eventually lead to the Varangian Guard in Constantinople. Ivar had broken the back of Saxon power, ensuring that England would never be a purely Saxon nation again. Ubbi had planted the seeds of a new Anglo-Norse society, and Sigurd had secured the legacy at home. Ragnar Lothbrok had been a legend, a myth, a singular point of terrifying light. But his sons were a prism. They took that light and refracted it into a spectrum that covered the known world. They surpassed their father in every metric: territory, wealth, cruelty, and statesmanship. Ragnar had raided a few monasteries. His sons conquered kingdoms. As the 9th century drew to a close, the fury of the Northmen was no longer a prayer said by monks. It was a political reality. The map had been redrawn in red ink. The sons of Ragnar had fulfilled the prophecy of the piglets. They had grunted, and the walls of the old world had come tumbling down. But with land comes responsibility, and with settlement comes a new kind of enemy. The Vikings were now the ones inside the castles, and there were new wolves circling in the woods waiting for their turn. The cycle of history continued, indifferent to the names of the kings, grinding on with the relentless inevitability of the tide. Trying to find the historical Ragnar Lothbrok is like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. You can see the shape of him, you can smell the fire he started, and you can certainly feel the heat. But the moment you try to grab the solid reality of the man, he slips through your fingers. To the modern fan of history, accustomed to birth certificates, social security numbers, and digital footprints, the 9th century is a frustratingly foggy place. The Vikings, for all their genius in boat building and metallurgy, were illiterate. They did not write diaries. They did not keep ledgers. They carved runes on stones, usually brief messages like, "Thorstein was here and he killed a lot of people," but they left the writing of history to their enemies. And enemies make terrible biographers. The primary sources we have for Ragnar come from the people he terrorized, the Frankish monks and the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers. To them, he was not a hero or a king. He was a natural disaster given a name. He was the wrath of God manifested in flesh and iron. Because of this, the Ragnar of the Chronicles is less a three-dimensional human being and more of a monster under the bed. He appears, he destroys, and he vanishes. However, if we sift through the ashes of the monasteries and the dusty parchment of the church archives, we can start to piece together a silhouette that might, just might, be the real man. Or more likely, the real men. Because the most prevailing theory among historians is that Ragnar Lothbrok is not one person, but a composite character. He is the greatest hits album of the Viking Age, a compilation of the deeds of several different warlords stitched together by later storytellers who wanted to create the ultimate ancestor. Let us look at the timeline. The first major Viking raid was Lindisfarne in the year 793. The siege of Paris was in the year 845. The great heathen army invaded England to avenge Ragnar's death in the year 865. If the same man led the raid on Lindisfarne as a young warrior and then died in Aela's snake pit, he would have been pushing 90 years old when he invaded Northumbria. While the idea of a 90-year-old Viking fighting a king is impressive, It is biologically improbable, even for a legend. So who are the candidates for the real Ragnar? The strongest contender for the Paris Ragnar is a chieftain named Regin Heirus. We find him in the Annals of Saint-Bertin, a Frankish chronicle that is generally considered reliable because it was written by people who were desperately trying to pay him to go away. This Reginarus is the one who sailed up the Seine in the year 845. He is the one who hanged the 111 prisoners in sight of Charles the Bald's army. He is the one who accepted the 7,000 pounds of silver as Downegeld. The chronicles describe him as a man of immense authority and terrifying cruelty. He fits the profile perfectly, but there is a catch. The annals also tell us that shortly after the raid, Regin Heirus died. He didn't die in a snake pit. He died of a divine plague, likely dysentery, shortly after returning to Denmark. The monks wrote this with great satisfaction, noting that he burst open and died in agony, which they naturally interpreted as God taking a very messy revenge for the looting of the churches. If Regin Heirus is Ragnar, then the story ends in 845. There is no Lagertha, no snake pit, and no vengeance. But then who is the father of the sons? This is where history gets stubborn. The existence of the sons of Ragnar is not in doubt. Ivar the Boneless, Ubbi, and Halfdan are well-documented historical figures. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is not prone to flight of fancy, lists them as the leaders of the great heathen army. They are real. They conquered kingdoms. They killed kings. And they called themselves Ragnarsson. In the patronymic naming system of the North, you are son of name. If Ivar called himself Ivar Ragnarsson, then his father was named Ragnar. This suggests that there was indeed a great king or warlord named Ragnar who lived in the mid-9th century, fathered these terrifying children, and died violently enough to trigger an invasion. This Ragnar might be different from the Regin Heirus of Paris. He might be a warlord who raided Ireland and Scotland, known in the Irish annals as Ragnall. The Irish annals are another fascinating puzzle piece. They mention a Ragnall who was a king of the fair foreigners, Norwegians, and dark foreigners, Danes. This Ragnall was active in the Irish Sea, raiding and politicking. Could the legend be a blending of Regin Heirus, the sacker of Paris, and Ragnall, the king of the Irish Sea? It is entirely possible. Oral tradition is like a game of telephone played over 3 centuries. Names get blended, dates get fuzzy, achievements get consolidated. Then we have the literary Ragnar. 200 years after the Viking Age ended, the Icelanders began to write down the oral sagas. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and the tale of Ragnar's sons were written in the 13th century. By this time, Ragnar had become a superhero. In these stories, he fights giant snakes to win Thora. He wears the magical shaggy breeches. He has adventures that defy physics. These texts are literature, not history. They are the Marvel movies of the Middle Ages, based on real characters, but with a lot of CGI added for effect. Similarly, the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus wrote Gesta Danorum, the deeds of the Danes, around the year 1200. Saxo had a political agenda. He wanted to prove that Denmark was an ancient civilized kingdom equal to Rome. He presents Ragnar as a Danish king, a noble monarch who battles legitimate wars. Saxo hates the farmer origin story. He wants Ragnar to be blue-blooded royalty. Saxo's Ragnar is less of a pirate and more of a general. He is trying to sanitize the barbarian. Between the dysentery-ridden Regin Heirus, the Irish warlord Ragnall, the superhero of the sagas, and the noble king of Saxo, the real man is lost. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Ragnar of history is not a biological individual, but a cultural necessity. The Viking Age was a time of explosive expansion. Young men left their farms to attack the greatest empires on earth. They needed a role model. They needed a prototype. Ragnar Lothbrok became the avatar of the Viking spirit. He embodied everything a Norseman aspired to be: curious, cunning, brave, and fatalistic. He was the man who started from nothing and took everything. He was the man who outsmarted the Franks and laughed at the English. By attributing all these great deeds to one man, the storytellers created a unifying myth for a fragmented people. Archaeology gives us the physical grounding for these myths. While we haven't found a grave marked Ragnar, we have found the footprints of his army. At Repton in England, archaeologists uncovered a massive defensive ditch and a burial mound from the winter of 873, when the great heathen army camped there. Inside, they found the disarticulated remains of hundreds of Viking warriors. Among them was a man of high status, buried with a Thor's hammer and a sword. He had died violently. A cut to his femur suggested a brutal battle death. But the most interesting detail was a boar's tusk buried with him. Was this a reference to the old boar? Probably not directly, but it shows the symbolism was real. These men lived and died by the symbols we read about in the sagas. The great army was not a myth. The destruction of the monasteries was not a myth. The sheer scale of the Scandinavian expansion is verified by the DNA of the British population today. We also have the rune stones. While none mention Ragnar directly by name as a king, there is the Rök runestone in Sweden, carved in the 9th century. It mentions Theodoric the Bold, but the text is a dense, poetic riddle about kings and vengeance. Some scholars have tried to link the obscure references to the Ragnar legends, suggesting that the stories were already circulating while the events were still fresh. The snake pit is another element that history struggles with. King Aile certainly existed, and he certainly died when the Vikings invaded. But did he really own a pit of snakes? It is unlikely. Snakes in Northumbria are small and shy, the European adder. You would need thousands of them to kill a man, and they go dormant in the winter. It is an impractical execution method. However, the metaphor is powerful. The snake is a Christian symbol of evil. By throwing Ragnar to the snakes, Aile was throwing him to the devil. By surviving the pain and laughing, Ragnar defeated the Christian symbol. It is a literary device, a poetic truth rather than a forensic one. Furthermore, we must consider the Ragnarsson brand. In the chaotic politics of the 9th century, claiming descent from a legendary hero was a great way to legitimize your rule. Ivar, Ubbe, and Bjorn were undeniably powerful warlords. By claiming they were all brothers and sons of the same great man, they created a coalition. It was a political alliance disguised as a family reunion. "We are the sons of Ragnar" was a slogan that meant we are united and we are unstoppable. It is entirely possible that they were not biological brothers, but sworn brothers who adopted the myth to bind their armies together. But does the lack of a definitive birth certificate make Ragnar any less real? Think about the impact. Real or composite, the idea of Ragnar Lothbrok changed the map of Europe. The fear of him caused Charles the Bald to pay the first Danegeld, setting a precedent that would drain the Frankish economy for a century. The vengeance for his death led to the Great Heathen Army, which destroyed the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, paving the way for the unification of England under Alfred. The settlements founded by his sons created the Danelaw, mixing Norse and Saxon culture to create the English language and identity we know today. If you judge a historical figure by their consequences, Ragnar is as real as Julius Caesar. He is the catalyst. He is the stone thrown into the pond that creates the ripples we are still surfing. There is also a fascinating psychological aspect to the Ragnar of history. He represents the moment Scandinavia looked in the mirror and realized it was powerful. Before the Viking Age, The North was a backwater, ignored by the civilized South. Ragnar is the moment the North talks back. He is the assertion of a culture that refused to be dismissed as barbarian. When he stands before the kings of Christendom and refuses to bow, he is every Viking farmer who ever felt looked down upon by a bishop. The real Ragnar was likely a very hard man. He would have been covered in lice, smelled of wood smoke and unwashed wool, and his teeth would have been worn down from eating grit-filled bread. He would not have looked like a model. He would have been a killer. The romanticized version, the philosopher king who seeks knowledge, is likely an invention of later writers who wanted to make him more palatable. The historical reality of a Viking warlord was a life of extreme violence, constant travel, and the perpetual risk of being murdered by your own brother. Yet there are flashes of the philosopher even in the history. The 845 raid on Paris showed a level of strategic planning that went beyond simple piracy. Hanging the prisoners to break morale, that is psychological warfare. Choosing Easter Sunday to attack, that shows an understanding of the enemy's culture. Reginarus, or whoever led that raid, was intelligent. He was not a mindless berserker. He was a general. So when we look for the Ragnar of history, we are looking for a ghost. But ghosts have power. The ghost of Ragnar Lothbrok haunted the dreams of King Aella. It haunted the treasury of the Franks. It haunted the coastlines of Ireland. And it still haunts us today. We keep telling his story in sagas, in novels, in television series, because there is something in the arc of his life that resonates. The desire to see what is over the horizon, the refusal to accept the station of your birth, the willingness to bet everything on a roll of the dice. Maybe the real Ragnar is simply the spirit of the age. He is the personification of the 2 centuries when the dragon ships ruled the waves. He is the human face we put on a complex geopolitical phenomenon to make it understandable. In the end, it doesn't matter if his bones are in a snake pit in Northumbria, a plague pit in Denmark, or lost at sea. What matters is that 1200 years later, we are still talking about him. We still know his name. In the Viking worldview, that is the only immortality that counts. Cattle die, kinsmen die. The self must also die, says the Havamal. The words of Odin. I know one thing that never dies, the reputation of each dead man. By that standard, Ragnar Lothbrok is the most alive man in history. He cheated the snake pit after all. He lives in the story, and as long as we tell it, the old boar is still grunting and the world is still listening. Chapter 12. The Ragnar of History. Trying to find the historical Ragnar Lothbrok is like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. You can see the shape of him, you can smell the fire he started, and you can certainly feel the heat. But the moment you try to grab the solid reality of the man, he slips through your fingers. To the modern fan of history, accustomed to birth certificates, social security numbers, and digital footprints, the 9th century is a frustratingly foggy place. The Vikings, for all their genius in boat building and metallurgy, were illiterate. They did not write diaries. They did not keep ledgers. They carved runes on stones, usually brief messages like, Thorstein was here and he killed a lot of people, but they left the writing of history to their enemies. And enemies make terrible biographers. The primary sources we have for Ragnar come from the people he terrorized, the Frankish monks and the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers. To them, he was not a hero or a king. He was a natural disaster given a name. He was the wrath of God manifested in flesh and iron. Because of this, the Ragnar of the Chronicles is less a three-dimensional human being and more of a monster under the bed. He appears, he destroys, and he vanishes. However, if we sift through the ashes of the monasteries and the dusty parchment of the church archives, we can start to piece together a silhouette that might, just might be the real man, or more likely, the real men. Because the most prevailing theory among historians is that Ragnar Lothbrok is not one person, but a composite character. He is the greatest hits album of the Viking Age, a compilation of the deeds of several different warlords stitched together by later storytellers who wanted to create the ultimate ancestor. Let us look at the timeline. The first major Viking raid was Lindisfarne in the year 793. The siege of Paris was in the year 845. The great heathen army invaded England to avenge Ragnar's death in the year 865. If the same man led the raid on Lindisfarne as a young warrior and then died in Aela's snake pit, he would have been pushing 90 years old when he invaded Northumbria. While the idea of a 90-year-old Viking fighting a king is impressive, it is biologically improbable, even for a legend. So who are the candidates for the real Ragnar? The strongest contender for the Paris Ragnar is a chieftain named Regin Heras. We find him in the Annals of Saint-Bertin, a Frankish chronicle that is generally considered reliable because it was written by people who were desperately trying to pay him to go away. This Reginerus is the one who sailed up the Seine in the year 845. He is the one who hanged the 111 prisoners in sight of Charles the Bold's army. He is the one who accepted the 7,000 pounds of silver as Danegeld. The chronicles describe him as a man of immense authority and terrifying cruelty. He fits the profile perfectly, but there is a catch. The annals also tell us that shortly after the raid, Regin Heras died. He didn't die in a snake pit. He died of a divine plague, likely dysentery, shortly after returning to Denmark. The monks wrote this with great satisfaction, noting that he burst open and died in agony, which they naturally interpreted as God taking a very messy revenge for the looting of the churches. If Regin Heras is Ragnar, then the story ends in 845. There is no Lagertha, no snake pit, and no vengeance. But then who is the father of the sons? This is where history gets stubborn. The existence of the sons of Ragnar is not in doubt. Ivar the Boneless, Ubbi, and Halfdan are well-documented historical figures. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is not prone to flight of fancy, lists them as the leaders of the great heathen army. They are real. They conquered kingdoms. They killed kings. And they called themselves Ragnarsson. In the patronymic naming system of the North, you are son of name. If Ivar called himself Ivar Ragnarsson, then his father was named Ragnar. This suggests that there was indeed a great king or warlord named Ragnar who lived in the mid-9th century, fathered these terrifying children, and died violently enough to trigger an invasion. This Ragnar might be different from the Regin Heras of Paris. He might be a warlord who raided Ireland and Scotland, known in the Irish annals as Ragnall. The Irish annals are another fascinating puzzle piece. They mention a Ragnall who was a king of the fair foreigners, Norwegians, and dark foreigners, Danes. This Ragnall was active in the Irish Sea, raiding and politicking. Could the legend be a blending of Regin Heras, the sacker of Paris, and Ragnall, the king of the Irish Sea? It is entirely possible. Oral tradition is like a game of telephone played over 3 centuries. Names get blended, dates get fuzzy, achievements get consolidated. Then we have the literary Ragnar. 200 years after the Viking Age ended, the Icelanders began to write down the oral sagas. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and the tale of Ragnar's sons were written in the 13th century. By this time, Ragnar had become a superhero. In these stories, he fights giant snakes to win Thora. He wears the magical shaggy breeches. He has adventures that defy physics. These texts are literature, not history. They are the Marvel movies of the Middle Ages, based on real characters, but with a lot of CGI added for effect. Similarly, the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus wrote Gesta Danorum, the deeds of the Danes, around the year 1200. Saxo had a political agenda. He wanted to prove that Denmark was an ancient civilized kingdom equal to Rome. He presents Ragnar as a Danish king, a noble monarch who battles legitimate wars. Saxo hates the farmer origin story. He wants Ragnar to be blue-blooded royalty. Saxo's Ragnar is less of a pirate and more of a general. He is trying to sanitize the barbarian. Between the dysentery-ridden Reginhirus, the Irish warlord Ragnall, the superhero of the sagas, and the noble king of Saxo, the real man is lost. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Ragnar of history is not a biological individual, but a cultural necessity. The Viking Age was a time of explosive expansion. Young men left their farms to attack the greatest empires on earth. They needed a role model. They needed a prototype. Ragnar Lothbrok became the avatar of the Viking spirit. He embodied everything a Norseman aspired to be: curious, cunning, brave, and fatalistic. He was the man who started from nothing and took everything. He was the man who outsmarted the Franks and laughed at the English. By attributing all these great deeds to one man, the storytellers created a unifying myth for a fragmented people. Archaeology gives us the physical grounding for these myths. While we haven't found a grave marked Ragnar, we have found the footprints of his army. At Repton in England, archaeologists uncovered a massive defensive ditch and a burial mound from the winter of 873, when the great heathen army camped there. Inside, they found the disarticulated remains of hundreds of Viking warriors. Among them was a man of high status, buried with a Thor's hammer and a sword. He had died violently. A cut to his femur suggested a brutal battle death. But the most interesting detail was a boar's tusk buried with him. Was this a reference to the old boar? Probably not directly, but it shows the symbolism was real. These men lived and died by the symbols we read about in the sagas. The great army was not a myth. The destruction of the monasteries was not a myth. The sheer scale of the Scandinavian expansion is verified by the DNA of the British population today. We also have the rune stones. While none mention Ragnar directly by name as a king, there is the Rök runestone in Sweden, carved in the 9th century. It mentions Theodoric the Bold, but the text is a dense poetic riddle about kings and vengeance. Some scholars have tried to link the obscure references to the Ragnar legends, suggesting that the stories were already circulating while the events were still fresh. The snake pit is another element that history struggles with. King Aile certainly existed, and he certainly died when the Vikings invaded, but did he really own a pit of snakes? It is unlikely. Snakes in Northumbria are small and shy, the European adder. You would need thousands of them to kill a man, and they go dormant in the winter. It is an impractical execution method. However, the metaphor is powerful. The snake is a Christian symbol of evil. By throwing Ragnar to the snakes, Aile was throwing him to the devil. By surviving the pain and laughing, Ragnar defeated the Christian symbol. It is a literary device, a poetic truth rather than a forensic one. Furthermore, we must consider the Ragnarsson brand. In the chaotic politics of the 9th century, claiming descent from a legendary hero was a great way to legitimize your rule. Ivar, Ubbe, and Bjorn were undeniably powerful warlords. By claiming they were all brothers and sons of the same great man, they created a coalition. It was a political alliance disguised as a family reunion. "We are the sons of Ragnar" was a slogan that meant we are united and we are unstoppable. It is entirely possible that they were not biological brothers, but sworn brothers who adopted the myth to bind their armies together. But does the lack of a definitive birth certificate make Ragnar any less real? Think about the impact. Real or composite, The idea of Ragnar Lothbrok changed the map of Europe. The fear of him caused Charles the Bald to pay the first Danegeld, setting a precedent that would drain the Frankish economy for a century. The vengeance for his death led to the Great Heathen Army, which destroyed the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, paving the way for the unification of England under Alfred. The settlements founded by his sons created the Danelaw, mixing Norse and Saxon culture to create the English language and identity we know today. If you judge a historical figure by their consequences, Ragnar is as real as Julius Caesar. He is the catalyst. He is the stone thrown into the pond that creates the ripples we are still surfing. There is also a fascinating psychological aspect to the Ragnar of history. He represents the moment Scandinavia looked in the mirror and realized it was powerful. Before the Viking Age, the North was a backwater, ignored by the civilized South. Ragnar is the moment the North talks back. He is the assertion of a culture that refused to be dismissed as barbarian. When he stands before the kings of Christendom and refuses to bow, he is every Viking farmer who ever felt looked down upon by a bishop. The real Ragnar was likely a very hard man. He would have been covered in lice, smelled of wood smoke and unwashed wool, and his teeth would have been worn down from eating grit-filled bread. He would not have looked like a model. He would have been a killer. The romanticized version, the philosopher king who seeks knowledge, is likely an invention of later writers who wanted to make him more palatable. The historical reality of a Viking warlord was a life of extreme violence, constant travel, and the perpetual risk of being murdered by your own brother. Yet there are flashes of the philosopher even in the history. The 845 raid on Paris showed a level of strategic planning that went beyond simple piracy. Hanging the prisoners to break morale, that is psychological warfare. Choosing Easter Sunday to attack, that shows an understanding of the enemy's culture. Reginarus, or whoever led that raid, was intelligent. He was not a mindless berserker. He was a general. So when we look for the Ragnar of history, we are looking for a ghost. But ghosts have power. The ghost of Ragnar Lothbrok haunted the dreams of King Aella. It haunted the treasury of the Franks. It haunted the coastlines of Ireland. And it still haunts us today. We keep telling his story in sagas, in novels, in television series, because there is something in the arc of his life that resonates. The desire to see what is over the horizon, the refusal to accept the station of your birth, the willingness to bet everything on a roll of the dice. Maybe the real Ragnar is simply the spirit of the age. He is the personification of the 2 centuries when the dragon ships ruled the waves. He is the human face we put on a complex geopolitical phenomenon to make it understandable. In the end, it doesn't matter if his bones are in a snake pit in Northumbria, a plague pit in Denmark, or lost at sea. What matters is that 1200 years later, we are still talking about him. We still know his name. In the Viking worldview, that is the only immortality that counts. Cattle die, kinsmen die. The self must also die, says the Havamal, the words of Odin. I know one thing that never dies, the reputation of each dead man. By that standard, Ragnar Lothbrok is the most alive man in history. He cheated the snake pit after all. He lives in the story. And as long as we tell it, the old boar is still grunting and the world is still listening. Ragnar Lothbrok did not die in a snake pit in Northumbria. That was merely the moment he shed his mortal skin to assume a form far more durable. The pop culture icon. If you walk down the street of any major city in the 21st century, you will see him. He is there in the beard of the barista pouring your coffee. He is there in the undercut hairstyle of the fitness influencer on your screen. He is there in the heavy metal music blasting from a passing car. The man who lived in a wooden longhouse and likely never bathed more than once a week has become the supreme aesthetic idol of the modern digital age. It is one of history's greatest ironies. The real Ragnar was a terrifying warlord who would have likely burned down your neighborhood for a silver bracelet. The Ragnar of Eternity, however, is a cool, philosophical rebel who fights the system. He has been repackaged, sanitized, and filtered through 1,000 years of storytelling until he is no longer a villain but an anti-hero we all secretly want to be. He has conquered the world not with axes, but with streaming subscriptions and video games. To understand how a 9th century pirate became the poster child for modern masculinity, we have to look at what we are missing in our own lives. We live in a world of safety belts, human resources departments, tax returns, and digital notifications. It is a safe world, a comfortable world, but often a deeply boring one. We are trapped in cubicles and traffic jams, regulated by laws and social norms that dictate everything from how we drive to how we speak. In this landscape of structured monotony, the Viking represents the ultimate escape fantasy. Ragnar Lothbrok is the antidote to the cubicle. He represents total agency. If he wants to go somewhere, he builds a boat and goes. If he wants something, he takes it. If someone disrespects him, he challenges them to a duel. He answers to no one but the gods, and even then he argues with them. This archetype, the free man, the wild man, resonates powerfully in a society that feels increasingly domesticated. We don't actually want to live in the 9th century. We like antibiotics and central heating too much, but we want to feel a fraction of that freedom. The journey of Ragnar's image is a fascinating study in cultural evolution. For centuries, he was the boogeyman, the pagan devil who destroyed civilization. Then, in the Romantic era of the 19th century, he was transformed into a noble savage, a Wagnerian hero in a horned helmet, which, for the record, he never wore. And finally, in our era, he has become the Sigma male, the misunderstood genius, the architect of his own destiny. We have projected our own desires onto him until the man himself has disappeared, replaced by a mirror reflecting our need for adventure. We forgive his brutality because we envy his conviction. We ignore the victims of his raids because we are too busy admiring his travel itinerary. The Ragnar of Eternity is not a history lesson. He is a mood board. He is the patron saint of everyone who has ever wanted to quit their job, buy a motorcycle, and drive into the sunset without a map. But as we explore this modern reinvention, we must ask, what does it say about us that our greatest hero is a man who built his legacy on fire and blood? The resurrection of Ragnar Lothbrok began not in Scandinavia, but in the drawing rooms of Victorian England. In the 19th century, Europe was undergoing the Industrial Revolution. Cities were becoming choked with smog. Factories were grinding people down, and the countryside was disappearing. In reaction to this mechanized ugliness, the artists and poets of the Romantic movement looked back to the past for something pure, primal, and heroic. They found the Vikings. However, the Victorians had a problem. The real Vikings were messy, violent, and morally ambiguous. So the Victorians invented a new version. They cleaned them up. This is where the famous horned helmet comes from. It was not a piece of military hardware. It was a costume design choice by Carl Emil Doppler for the first production of Wagner's opera cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen in 1876. Doppler thought the horns looked dramatic on stage. He was right. They looked fantastic. Unfortunately, he inadvertently rewrote history. For the next 100 years, every cartoon, comic book, and Halloween costume of a Viking would feature horns, despite the fact that wearing handles on your head in a sword fight is a suicidal tactical error. Ragnar Lothbrok in this era became a tragic, operatic figure. He was portrayed as a noble king who spoke in poetic stanzas and died for his honor. The Victorians ignored the slavery, the human sacrifice, and the looting. They focused on the noble spirit of exploration. Ragnar became a sort of wet, angry version of King Arthur. But the true explosion of the Ragnar myth, the one that conquered the entire globe, happened in the 21st century, and it started with a haircut. When the television series Vikings premiered in 2013, it introduced Ragnar to a massive global audience who likely couldn't find Denmark on a map. Played by Travis Fimmel, this Ragnar was different. He wasn't the shouting, hulking brute of the old comic books. He was quiet. He had piercing blue eyes that seemed to be constantly laughing at a private joke. He was small compared to his brother Rollo, but he was smarter. He was a thinker. This portrayal fundamentally changed the archetype. Suddenly, being a Viking wasn't just about muscles. It was about mindset. The Ragnar haircut, shaved sides, long braided top, often tied back, became the defining look of the decade. Barbershops from Brooklyn to Berlin were suddenly flooded with men demanding the Lothbrok fade. It became a uniform for the modern hipster warrior, a way to signal ruggedness while sipping an oat milk latte. The irony of adopting the hairstyle of a man who would have likely raided the coffee shop and enslaved the barista was lost on everyone. But that is the beauty of pop culture. It consumes everything and turns it into fashion. The show also did something brilliant. It secularized the ambition. Ragnar wasn't just fighting for Odin, he was fighting for knowledge. He was curious. He wanted to see what was over the hill. This resonated deeply with a generation obsessed with travel and experiences. Ragnar became the ultimate digital nomad, just with more axes and fewer laptops. His relationship with Athelstan, the Christian monk, allowed modern audiences to project their own religious skepticism onto him. We saw a man questioning the dogma of his time, just as we question ours. Then came the video games. Assassin's Creed Valhalla and the rebooted God of War franchise placed the player directly inside the boots of a Norse warrior. In Valhalla, you essentially play as a spiritual successor to Ragnar. You build a settlement, you raid monasteries, you navigate political alliances. But the game sanitizes the experience. In the game, you can choose not to kill civilians, mostly. You are a good invader. It allows us to indulge in the power fantasy of the Viking Age without the moral nausea of the reality. We get to feel the thrill of the shield wall, the weight of the axe, the camaraderie of the longship, all from the safety of our living rooms. This digitization of Ragnar has led to a strange internet phenomenon, the Sigma male Viking. If you scroll through TikTok or Instagram Reels, you will inevitably find videos of Ragnar Lothbrok set to heavy bass funk music. The captions are usually motivational quotes about grinding, ignoring haters, and building an empire. The king who listens to everyone is not a king, the text might say, over a clip of Ragnar staring intensely at a fire. Ragnar has been co-opted by the hustle culture. He is presented as the ultimate entrepreneur. He started with nothing, a farmer, took high risks sailing west, disrupted the market, raiding, and built a brand, the legend. He is used to sell everything from cryptocurrency courses to gym memberships. The fact that the historical Ragnar operated in a gift economy where hoarding wealth was seen as shameful is irrelevant. To the internet, he is the CEO of Violence Inc. The concept of Valhalla has also been warped. In the myths, Valhalla is a grim training ground for a futile war at the end of time. It is a place of eternal wounding and fighting. In pop culture, Valhalla has become a VIP club in the sky. It is heaven for cool people. We shout "Until Valhalla" as a toast, stripping it of its apocalyptic context and turning it into a generic slogan of brotherhood. But why does this specific figure endure? Why Ragnar and not, say, Charlemagne or Alfred the Great? It is because Ragnar represents the underdog. We love the story of the outsider who crashes the party. The kings of England and Francia were established, wealthy, and arrogant. Ragnar was the disruptor. He was the punk rocker crashing the opera. There is a deep, primal satisfaction in watching the civilized world panic in the face of raw, natural force. We see the crumbling institutions of our own time, corrupt politicians, failing banks, ineffective leaders, and a part of us cheers for the man who comes to burn it all down. Ragnar is the chaos we secretly crave. Furthermore, the Ragnar of eternity allows us to explore a version of masculinity that feels endangered. In a world where toxic masculinity is rightly criticized, the Viking archetype offers a safe space to be primal. It is a space of brotherhood, physical competence, and stoic emotionality. Men look at the bond between Ragnar and Floki, or Ragnar and Bjorn, and see a depth of male friendship that is often missing in modern life. They see men who would literally die for each other. It is a nostalgic longing for a tribe. However, we must also acknowledge the dark side of this worship. The appropriation of Viking symbols by white supremacist groups is a stain on the legacy. They try to twist the Norse myths into a narrative of racial purity, which is historically laughable. The Vikings were globalists. They mixed with everyone: Slavs, Celts, Franks, even people from the Islamic world. Ragnar's own DNA, if we could test it, would likely be a map of his travels. The Ragnar of eternity fights a constant battle against these co-options. The storytellers and historians have a duty to keep the complexity alive, to remind the world that Ragnar was not a symbol of hate, but of expansion. The commercialization of Ragnar is absolute. You can buy Ragnar beard oil, Ragnar t-shirts, Ragnar throwing axes, and Ragnar-themed mead. There are tours in Ireland and England that retrace the steps of the great heathen army, where tourists take selfies on the spots where monks were slaughtered. We have turned a genocide into a vacation package. It is grotesque, but it is also a testament to the power of the story. Time heals all wounds, and apparently it turns all tragedies into merchandise. Yet, despite the kitsch and the bad haircuts, there is something genuinely moving about the survival of his name. Think of the thousands of kings, emperors, and generals who have lived and died since the 9th century. Most are forgotten. Their statues are crumbled. Their names are answers to trivia questions. But Ragnar is alive. He lives because he embodies the fundamental human question. Is this it? When Ragnar looked at his farm in Kattegat and felt that gnawing dissatisfaction, he felt what every human being has felt. The sense that there must be more to see, more to know, more to feel. His solution was extreme. Invading other countries is not a recommended therapy for midlife crisis, but the impulse was universal. He is the patron saint of curiosity. As we look to the future, the Ragnar of eternity shows no sign of fading. As we look to the stars and talk about colonizing Mars, we use Viking metaphors. We name our space probes after Norse gods. We talk about voyages into the unknown. Ragnar is already packing his bags for the next frontier. The longship has become the spaceship. The grey Atlantic has become the black void of space. But the spirit is the same. In the end, the Ragnar of the 21st century is a mirror. If you look at him and see a bloodthirsty savage, you are seeing your own fear of chaos. If you look at him and see a noble hero, you are seeing your own desire for freedom. If you look at him and see a Sigma male entrepreneur, you are seeing your own ambition. He is a blank rune upon which we carve our own meanings. The snake pit failed, King Aila failed, time failed. Ragnar Lothbrok achieved the only immortality that is real. He became a word that means courage. a word that means adventure, a word that means destiny. And somewhere in the great mead hall of the collective unconscious, the old boar is sitting by the fire, drinking from a curved horn, watching us buy beard oil with his face on it, and laughing. He is laughing because he knows the secret. He knows that stories are stronger than steel, and his story is just getting started. So when you see a kid with a braided undercut playing a video game where he raids a digital monastery, remember, that is Ragnar. He is not dead. He is just evolving. The saga does not end. It just updates.